it. Trauma-informed care is a focus for Family Promise National, and I'm proud to say that it's a focus of our local affiliate, Family Promise of Clark County. Trauma-informed care is the best training available in equipping practitioners and people who are working with people who are in need to make sure that you're being the most effective you can be in your conversations and your work with people. And Family Promise sees it as our responsibility to make sure that not only our staff, but our volunteers are fully equipped to make the best impact that they can in their conversations with the guests who we're so privileged to serve. Very, very happy that we get to introduce to you to Cindy Meyer of Clark County Public Health. She's also with the ACES Action Alliance and is just regarded as one of the authorities on trauma-informed care in Clark County. Welcome you to our training, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, David. And I just cannot tell you how much I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm so pleased with the important dedication and emphasis you're putting on this topic. So thank you to Family Promise. And I'm so excited to work with everybody today and get to know some new friends. So I'd like to start off this morning by just introducing myself and some of the work that I do. As David said, my name is Cindy Meyer. I've been with Clark County Public Health for about 8 years now, where my focus has been very predominantly in this field of adverse childhood experiences. And as I've worked in that, I've realized that trauma and stress does not just happen to children. It does have significant impact that's a little different than when it happens to adults. But these lessons are universal, whether we're carrying childhood trauma in our hearts as adults or whether we are adults who've just experienced a traumatic event ourselves. So I think there'll be a lot of things that apply to all of us. The quote from Helen Keller that says, "The world is full of suffering, but it is also full of overcoming." And I truly believe that with my heart and soul, that even in times of great tragedy or trauma, we need to have hope in our lives. And we're finding out more and more about the power of hope. So I can't really see everybody today right now because I don't have y'all on my screen, but I'm just maybe think to yourself, if you've heard of ACES or you've had some training on ACES, I'd be really curious about that. Toxic stress and resilience. We're going to be talking about all those topics today. And I just want to say that even if you've been through an ACES training or a training on trauma-informed care or something else, I personally find that every time I attend a training, even if it's a basic 101 training on ACES, and I attend a lot of them, I learn something new, or while I'm learning it, I think of a new application, or I have more compassion for someone in my family or for myself or for work that I do. So even if this is a review for you, I'm really glad you're here because I think that the more times we hear this, the better we get at explaining it to someone else or to applying this information in our own lives. So I want to thank you for being here. I'm going to start off today from a strengths-based perspective because that is an important part of being trauma-informed, is focusing on hope and strength and looking for those strengths in ourselves and others. So there's a way that we kind of look at this that is the 7 C's of resilience. And I love that idea, the 7 C's, you know. So here are the 7 C's. The first one is connection. And we get connections through our family members, through having that modeled, through being part of groups, through making friends. And it helps us with our ability to handle the strife and the things that we come up against because we can reach out to others. This is an area that I'm working on personally. I tend to isolate a lot in my private life. And so I've found that this is really critical. They find that people who have 3 or more people in their lives that they could just turn to for a cup of sugar or a ride to the doctor or something have far more resilience and better health outcomes over a long time. So connection is an important C of resilience. Confidence is another one, and that's our solid belief in our own abilities and skills. And we often get this through reflection about what we have done. So thinking about how we're doing, we get it because of our own intrinsic value, which is built not through praise, but through feedback and through learning. Even making mistakes can help us to build our confidence because then we can go back and repair and fix it. Our character is very important. That's that fundamental sense of right and wrong. And I would guess that most people get that from family members, from teachers, from faith communities, that they learn that information. So imagine if you do not have those things in your early life, how that might really impact your character and your ability to tell right from wrong. Coping is another C that's very important, and that is the ability to have ways of managing your stress or difficult situations in a positive, healthy way. And if we don't have those good positive coping mechanisms, we may go into something more negative. Addiction can end up as a result of that. So having good positive coping. Competence is the ability to handle situations effectively and being able to trust our own judgment. And so as an example for me, I'm competent in writing. I love it. And I learned that because of a connection with a boss who was very adamant that I become a good writer. And then I went on and got a college degree in that. So competence is important. Contribution, knowing that you are doing good for your community and for those around you. We all need that. And I can tell the people in this room would not argue with me about that, because here you are today. And then having that sense of control around our lives and around our circumstances. That is something that we learn by making decisions. Even if we don't always make the right decision, at least we can have voice and choice. We are empowered and we have that ability to exercise that. And so that's an important thing to remember when people come to you for help, as maybe your clients have done, is letting people have as much control as they can over their lives and their decisions. So I'd like you to think for just a moment and reflect on, we were going to do breakouts, but since we spent a bit of time on introductions, we'll just have you think in your own mind for a minute and make a jot down on a piece of paper. What are your strongest C's? What of the 7 C's, what are your top 3 that you have in your life? And think a little bit about who helped you to develop those strengths and how did you get them? So we'll go back to the list real quick. Connection, confidence, character, coping, competence, contribution, and control. Maybe you have all of them. Maybe one of them you could do more on, like I can. I can do better on connection. So whatever you might want to list the one that you want to work on, but please keep that list of your strongest strengths right nearby today, because we're going to be talking about a lot of difficult topics. And it's good, as we're talking about trauma, if you go into a dark place, to come back to those, look down on your little cheat sheet and say, but remember, I have these great life skills. I have these strengths that I can rely back on. Because no matter how much we talk about trauma, no matter how much trauma we've had in our life, far more important is the resilience that we have and the resilience that we have developed. So I want you to keep that front and center as we go on today. And then at the end of today, I'm hoping that you'll all take time for self-care at the end of today. This is a long meeting, a long training. We even thought about doing it in a full day training all at once, but I think that especially today's content is kind of heavy. So do something nice for yourself tonight. Talk it over with a friend or relative. Do whatever soothes you. A lot of people say, oh, I go take a hot bath. I find that to be really distressing to me because I get overheated and I drop my book in the water and that kind of thing. So I prefer to vacuum, but you pick what really works for you and what helps you feel comfortable. So before we go into this, I just want to have a moment to bring our minds into focus. And I'm going to be using a few of these little brain breaks today to just kind of model for you some things that we can do with clients who are feeling really distressed, or in our own lives when we're feeling a little out of control or highly anxious, ways to kind of focus ourselves. So our first one is, I put a picture there of a beautiful meadow because I want you to think of a place that you really love, a place that represents safety for you. And then maybe close your eyes and envision that spot and see yourself sitting there in that beautiful place or standing there. And then I want you to, while you're visualizing that, think about the smells that you would perceive. Think about the way the air feels on your face. Think about the sounds you might hear. Think about just all those beautiful feelings, and then just slow your breathing down and bring yourself into that place. So as you breathe, I want you to inhale for a count of about 4 through your nose. Inhale 4, hold it for 4, and then exhale slowly through your mouth for a count of 4. So why don't we do that 3 times? Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait. And exhale. One more time. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it. And exhale through your mouth. One last time. Inhale. Hold it. And exhale. Okay, welcome back. I wanted to do that little brain break this morning because getting into Zoom, going through all the difficulties with muting and so forth, it can get us a little rattled and not as ready to absorb the information. So when you do a meeting or you're going into meeting with people or you're feeling anxious, you can do a little breathing exercise like that. It will help you to focus and to calm so you can better absorb the information. So hopefully we're all focused now and can talk about these things. So we're going to be talking a lot about trauma, no surprise today. And I wanted to give you a little quick definition of what trauma is. Trauma involves an event, something that was unexpected, that we didn't know was going to happen. And it gives us an experience where the experiencer is unprepared for it, feels that they cannot stop it, feels like they are out of control, and the event is perceived as emotionally or harmful or threatening. And the result has a negative impact on their emotional, social, behavioral, or physical health. And the reason I want to share that with you is that it takes all three of those things for it to be a truly traumatic event for somebody. People can experience different events differently. And I hope this won't, it's a story about a cat. So I'll, turn off your sound if you don't want to hear this, if it will upset you. But my friends had a pet cat, and at the middle of a dinner party one night, the cat let out a shriek and had a stroke and just died right there. And three of the people at the table who were close to that cat were totally traumatized. They could not go on for the rest of the evening and were upset for days about this. It was very upsetting. And for other people at the table, they were like, well, it's a cat. They weren't fazed by it at all. So you can see how the experience had a really negative feeling for some people and didn't for others. And that's how trauma is. We all experience events differently. So what's traumatic for me may not be for you. There are also types of trauma. The first kind we have is the trauma happens to me personally. So let's say I'm driving down the street and somebody gets mad at me, jumps out and hits my car with a baseball bat and screams at me. I've experienced primary trauma. Secondary is I'm in the car next to the person that happened to. I see it happen. I'm traumatized because I saw this event. Then I go home that night and share that with my husband, and that person is now traumatized through vicarious or tertiary trauma. And then there's historical and intergenerational trauma, which is if I am part of a race or an ethnic group or have some kind of identity with a group that is always hit by baseball bats every time I'm in my car, I'm going to be experiencing this. So it has nothing to do with me personally. It has to do with the group that I belong to. And whether or not it happens, I'm fearful it could happen because there's this history. So I want to ask you, and you can unmute hopefully to answer this question. Can you think of groups that might be experiencing historical or intergenerational trauma in our community? Anybody want to just speak out? If you
Native populations?
Yeah, the Native American population definitely is experiencing historical and intergenerational trauma. That's right. People who've lived in, go ahead.
Immigrants.
Yes, definitely.
Asian American, Pacific Islanders.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And especially right now with our Asian American Pacific Islander community, that's really raised to the awareness because of all the recent attacks. This was originally identified through Holocaust survivors and their families. So that was when they first learned about historical trauma, was that the children of Holocaust survivors were experiencing deep depression, and it was related back to the anxiety that was kind of handed down from their parents. So there's a number of reasons for this, and we're going to talk about those today. So we have stress in our lives, right? There's trauma and then there's stress. And stress can actually be a really positive thing for us. Things like a wedding could be stressful. Things like going on a date can be stressful. It can also be things like taking a test or having to get into college or something like that. Those things are stressful, but they're moderate, they're brief, they could even be positive. And they're important because if we have no stress, parts of our brain really don't develop on how to address challenges in our life. Then there's tolerable stress, and that's the kind that has that ability to alter our brains because it's so terrible, like the loss of a loved one or the loss of a cat, But if we have good people around us who are supportive and loving and help to see us through that, it is not going to affect us for a long, long time. It'll have a brief and manageable amount of stress. And then there's toxic stress, which is strong, frequent, prolonged. And that's where we might know that we're living with an abuser, or we're being neglected as a child, or we're having to face the stress of homelessness for years on end. And those kinds of things will really affect our body systems and affect the health of our bodies, the development of our brains if we're children, and the way that we react to people and situations. So all of this is kind of dependent on our individual differences, because what is, as we said before, what's traumatic and stressful for one person may not have the same impacts for the next person. That all depends on the type of traumatic event. It depends on whether it was expected or unexpected. Like, let's say that there's a big giant storm coming and we know that the storm is coming, or we know that we may be evicted from home, even though the homelessness that may result is going to be stressful and traumatic. It may not be as bad if we're able to predict it and maybe in some way prepare some support systems for ourselves. The number of previous exposures. So if this is something that's gone on and on in your life, it recompounds it and recompounds it so that it really becomes that chronic stress, toxic stress. The time in a person's life really determines how it's going to impact the brain and body in the long term. So this is the biggest difference between trauma in an adult life versus a child's life. In a child's life, trauma can actually rewire the brain permanently for the rest of that person's life. And it can result in our body systems running on high gear and being ready to respond at any moment throughout the rest of our life. If you're an adult, this may happen for a period of time, but it may not be permanent. PTSD might be an exception to that, where we really have to work hard as an adult to overcome post-traumatic stress syndrome when it's been a warfare or a really deep traumatic experience. But the time in the person's life makes a difference in how it will develop and show itself. And that even has a difference in childhood. Depending on the age of a child, it may affect different parts of the developing brain because the brain develops at different times. So depending on what age you are, it may have a different outcome or result. And then there's genetics. Some of us are just born more resilient than others. And if we're lucky, we are a resilient dandelion kind of person that can thrive even in a drought or even in a difficult situation. But there are others who are very highly sensitive. They say about 20% of the population are highly sensitive, and that is just the way their bodies and brains are built. And so for those folks, they may need a little additional support than someone else. Harvard Center for Developing Child is actually doing studies on this, where they can test the cortisol levels in a child's mouth, which is the stress chemical, and they can measure brain waves and determine from that if a child is a highly sensitive child who's going to be more sensitive to trauma versus one who's very hardy and resilient and can take themselves on. And when we hear people say, well, you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that may be true for the person who is born with the genetics to be very resilient and resourceful. That may not be true for someone who doesn't have that aptitude genetically. And then finally, what are the available resources and ongoing supports? If you've experienced trauma, but there's great mental health supports, there's family members around, you have got the kinds of services connected in your community to help you and your family, you're going to do much better than someone who feels like they're wandering alone in a desert, right? So all of those things are going to make a difference in how trauma and stress impact us. So I want to share with you a little information about the study that really turned our attention to this important information. And that was a study done by Drs. Folletti and Anda back in the mid-1990s at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. Dr. Folletti had a cardiac care weight management program there. He started to notice that people were reporting a high incidence of childhood adversity when they came in with severe cardiac disease. And also that when they were in weight management programs, many people who were very overweight had some trauma in their backgrounds and also struggled more to keep that weight off. So they developed a list of questions and asked them, and they enrolled 17,000 participants in that study, which is a huge and very significant number. All of them were insured, most were employed or had a spouse that was employed, about 78% Caucasian and 75% college educated. So these were not homeless people struggling with historical trauma necessarily that they knew about up front, at least from their ethnic group or whatever. They were pretty privileged folks in good socioeconomic status. So just keep that in mind when we look at the numbers that came from this study. So Folletti and Anda asked these folks 10 questions, which probably you've heard before. Have you, before you were 18 years old, experienced abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or any one of 5 different types of family dysfunction, including was anyone in your family mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal? Was anyone using substance abuse or addiction, abusing substances or addicted? Did your parents get along, or did their marriage end in divorce, separation, or abandonment? Did you see domestic violence? And today we would say neighborhood violence as well. Was any family member incarcerated? They did not ask about poverty, homelessness, racism, disasters, war, or medical trauma. But today, researchers are really enlarging that scope of what are ACEs, what are adverse childhood experiences. That's what ACEs stands for. They're enlarging that to include a lot of these things because we know that those could also be. But the way Anda and Folletti looked at this, they said, well, if someone is living in poverty or is homeless, they may have great family supports. So that may not be an ACE in itself. It may be that their parents have offset it to the point, or their communities offset it to the point that it doesn't traumatize them. But today we are looking at that a little bit differently. We are also enlarging our realms of ACEs to include more than just what's happening in the household. We also look at what's happening in our community. Are we growing up in an environment that is really impoverished, where the community itself is violent, where there's poor wages and poor housing options that we can't have? There's a lack of jobs. Our schools are substandard. Our classrooms are overcrowded. They're not trauma informed. So those are some of the things that we might experience in our community that help set the stage for more trauma and stress in a child's life. And then we also look at our environment. I've heard stories where children are hearing so much about climate change that they're terribly frightened that their pets are going to die, that all the animals are going to die. They're living with this worry in a constant state. So worrying about disasters or climate crisis or experiencing those can also be extremely traumatic for children and anyone, actually. So if you were doing what I did the first time I saw that list, I was counting up how many of those 10 items on the ACE questionnaire I had in my life. And I want to really clarify for a minute what that ACE score is or is not, because you may have heard people talk about the ACE score. So it's simply the number out of 10 of those childhood experiences that you have had before you were 18. So first of all, that's not a fun quiz. And so it's not something we run around and ask each other about, what's your ACE score? But it's also not a diagnosis. And we're going to talk in a minute about, on a population level, over 17,000 people, what Anda and Folletti found. But what they found doesn't mean that if you individually had a higher ACE score, that you are individually going to have a lot of diagnoses that are negative. Because as we talked about before, resilience trumps ACEs. Resilience is the stronger thing and is in what can overcome any trauma or stress that we've had. It's also not necessarily an indicator of bad parenting. It can be. It can mean that our parents had an unfortunate childhood themselves. Most of the time, parents do the best they can with the skills they've got. Most of the time, parents are human and they may make mistakes, or they may misapply what they learned, or they had things that put them into fight, freeze, flight as an adult. So even though we want to say, hey, yes, this happened to me and it was horrible, we may also want to give some forgiveness if things happened to us that weren't perfect. And if we were parents and did something that we now feel, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that, you know, I want you to just say, I'm on a learning curve here. We're knowing more today than we knew before. It can sometimes mean that there is bad parenting when someone abandons their child, but we don't know their reasons for doing that either. So just going to leave it at that. And again, the ACE score is not the whole story. Our resilience is far more important. But what it is, as you all said, this is going to give us a language for communicating, where instead of someone having to tell us their whole story of sexual abuse and how they were neglected and they were abandoned, all these things that would re-trigger them if they shared that, they can just come to you and say, hey, I've got a really high ACE score. So I just think you should know that about me, because it may change my reactions from time to time. And you can help me with that by just being understanding and compassionate. So it gives us that common language. It helps us share information. If our doctors know what ACEs are and we go to the doctor and say that, the doctor then knows, okay, I'm going to do a few extra screening tests. I'm going to keep an eye on stress-related issues that could happen. And it also gives us that doorway to compassion and healing that you all have mentioned earlier today when you talked about why you're here. We want to be more compassionate, more understanding. And I want to point out, even though we've talked about this as adverse childhood experiences, this is not just about children. Adverse childhood experiences happen before 18, but as we said, we not only can experience stress and trauma as adults, but we also carry that inner child within us. So even if you experience this at the age of 5, that little child is still with you at any time. And I'm going to tell you an example of that. I was at a meeting at a big, long conference table one day. There were only 3 of us in the room. I was taking the notes and facilitating the meeting. 2 people at the other end of the table started to argue with one another, and it became rather heated. And all of a sudden, I just felt like a darkness had fallen over me. I couldn't find my words. I got disconnected from what my agenda was. I couldn't keep track of time. And basically, I had to end the meeting. And over the next 2 days, that darkness stayed with me. And I felt just so depressed. And I thought, what happened in that meeting? Why did that affect me so much? And then I realized it was the same setup that we'd had at my family dinner table when there would be fighting that took place and terrible disagreements and conflicts that would sometimes end in violence. And it just put me right back there. And that happened when I was only 10 years old, but I was a 10-year-old in that meeting. I went right back there immediately. So we carry that with us inside of us, and we may have to address it over and over throughout our lifetimes. So I think that if you think about that, this may be what a lot of folks who are ending up in your care and with your service may be carrying that within themselves, and it makes it harder and harder for them to cope with day-to-day situations. So back to my friends, Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti, in their study at Kaiser, they found that 62% of those folks who were employed and Caucasian and in good socioeconomic statuses, 62% of them had one ACE, more than one ACE, and 27% had 3 or more. When we start to get up to a number of 4 or more, it becomes more and more significant. By the time you have 6 or more, it has a definite impact. So yeah, just to put that in perspective. And they also found that parents who have 2 or more ACEs are 8 times more likely to have 2 or more conditions, such as an illness, a mental illness, or to be divorced, or that type of thing, that can create ACEs for their children. So that's part of the way that this becomes a historical intergenerational issue. So what about the kids? What we found here in Washington State a few years back when we did a study, we found that 12% of our little guys and 42% of our high school students have 3 or more ACEs. 42% of our high school kids today. And in an average Washington State classroom, 7 kids in high school classroom are going to have 4 or 5 ACEs, and 3 are going to have 6 or more. So you think about behavior issues that we're having in our classrooms today and in our schools, kids acting out more, and then you add on top of that the impact of social media and high expectations and all the rest of it. It really increases my compassion for our kids nowadays and what they're going through. What we found with the Healthy Youth Survey in 2018, we did the schools do a survey of kids every 2 years. And in the 10th graders in 2018 in Clark County, we found 18% reported they'd been sexually abused. And you can see how it goes up here: bullied, physical abuse, all the way up to emotional abuse. More than 1/3 of kids reported that they were emotionally abused. Those are really striking numbers just right here in Clark County. So let's go back to Anda and Folletti and what they did with their information. They took that information and they plotted it on a graph against the incidence of different health outcomes. And what they found was that there was a dose response, meaning the higher the number of ACEs, the greater the incidence of all kinds of health outcomes, poor health outcomes, including addiction, COPD, depression, losing your baby early, illicit drug use, heart disease, liver disease, all STDs, smoking, all of these things. So to quantify that for you, let's just take a look at what that meant. With 0 ACEs, they found that 1 in 7 people experienced low mental health well-being, and that dropped to 1 in 2.5 people. I hate to think of that half person with low mental well-being. But look at these other things too. 1 in 16 smokes at 0 ACEs, 1 in 6 smokes at 7 or more, 1 in 480 people will use IV drugs if they have 0 ACEs, and that jumps to 1 out of 30 people are using IV drugs with 7 or more. 1 in 96 attempt suicide with 0 ACEs. 1 in 5 will attempt or at least think about suicide with 7 or more ACEs. So it was a definite, and they did this over and over and over again, and they found with all health indicators, it just happened over and over again. So we found that here in Clark County. We took a look again in the Health Youth Survey and said, what's your risk of using alcohol? Did you use alcohol? And we found that based on these different indicators for ACEs, it did show an increase use of with different kinds of compared to other 10th graders who had not experienced adversity. We also looked at our truant population, or folks from WSU Vancouver and the juvenile court did a survey of our truants in juvenile detention a number of years back. And what they found was that the number of kids in the truancy program were 4 times higher than the number of people who had 4 or more ACEs in the Kaiser study. So I think these things all point to verifying, even locally, what Anda and Folletti discovered. To try and explain this, they put together what we call the ACE paradigm, and this is a picture of it right here, where as we move forward from the time we're conceived until our death, we start off with that generational genetic embodiment that comes from historical trauma. We're then born into local social conditions or contexts, maybe a good neighborhood, maybe a dangerous neighborhood. Then we may experience adversity in our childhood, so that's layered on. The result then is that that can disrupt our neurodevelopment. Instead of making all the connections that we would want to make for a child's brain may not make the same or make very different ones that are not as healthy. The result then is social, emotional, and thinking impairment. So we can't think as well, we can't relate to others as well. And to cope with that, we may adopt health risk behaviors as coping mechanisms that can make us sick over a long time. We might start smoking or drinking or taking drugs to help ease the pain of those things. And those health risk behaviors, as well as the fight flight mode that keeps our stress hormones on high gear all the time, those can result in disease, disability, and social problems. As a full result, they found that people with an ACE score of 6 or more typically had an age expectancy of 20 years less than those who had no ACEs. Now I'll tell you, there are exceptions to that because I don't want you to be counting up and say, oh my gosh, I'm going to die tomorrow if I had a high ACE score. My mom grew up in the Great Depression. She had no money, one of 12 kids. Her father was arrested, sent to prison. Her mother worked out of town, so she was left alone to take care of her little brother while her mom went off to work in a mental institution. She often didn't have enough food to eat. She'd wake up in the morning with snow covering her blankets that had blown in through the slats in the walls. And the stories just went on and on from her. It was a difficult childhood. And you would think that she would probably have passed away at the age of 60. But my mom lived until last year, and she died 19 days short of her 100th birthday. She was a strong, capable woman who lived independently in her own apartment, took great care of herself, and was a go-getter. And I think that her strength really came from those indicators of resilience that I've heard summed up as faith, friends, family, food, and fun. So she had those 5 F's in her life. And I think if we can focus on those, we can really overcome a lot of things. So faith, friends, family, food, and fun. So Anda and Folletti did a follow-up study a few years later where they looked at what happens as we grow up, what happens to us as employees if we have high ACE scores. So they went back to those same people, asked them more questions, and here's what they found. Among employees, they found that with 0 ACEs, an employee had 37% reported relationship problems compared to 57% reporting relationship problems with 4 or more. 21% had emotional issues compared to 49%. 22% were abusing substances versus 52. So this is why this information is important for us to know, even if we're adults, and even if we're working with adults, and not just children, this stuff continues to affect us for a lifetime. And there's things we can do about that as adults. We can still build our resilience. We can still take care of ourselves as adults. So it's important information for everyone. So if you think for a minute about what happens if you were, and I have a bear up here, but if you're in the woods and you look up, you're having a nice, lovely walk, and all of a sudden there's a bear coming toward you. What happens? How do you feel? So for me, I have not faced a bear, but I faced a mountain lion. And the worst thing were these giant rats that came into a cabin I was staying in Montana. And they were these huge rats. They weren't just regular rats. They were like a football, and they would not go away. They kept coming back and coming back. And I'll tell you, within seconds, I heard someone screaming, and I didn't know who it was, but someone was screaming. So that's the first thing that happened. I felt the hair raise on my neck. I felt my heart start to increase and start pumping so fast I could hardly get my breath, and my body just became immediately tense. My muscles tensed up. I just was ready to run or to hit them with something. I mean, I was out of my mind with craziness about this. My vision became very focused. All of a sudden, my hearing was more acute. My stomach became kind of knotted because I just, I really was focusing on this. And I couldn't really at that moment think of anything but getting away from those big old rats. And so that was my immediate response. That happens because that's the natural survival instinct that we have from the parts of our brain that are our oldest, that we share in conjunction with reptiles and with mammals and with other animals. It's our survival instincts. And that comes from deep in our brain, from our brainstem, where our body controls our heart rate and so forth, but also our midbrain and our limbic system, which house our emotions and our memories and make those connections and then release our stress hormones or send the signals to address our release stress hormones like adrenaline from our adrenal glands. So all of that happens within a matter of seconds. And what also happens is that those parts of our inner old survival brain take over. And when we're in stress like that, we go into that fight, freeze, flight, and our thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, shuts off. We cannot at that moment learn. We can't compose music. We can't write a novel. We couldn't do well on a test at that moment. We just are not in our thinking brain. We're not modulating our responses and thinking, oh, I wonder if this is a good idea or if that's a good idea. We aren't there. We're just responding through survival mechanisms. And that's great if we're in the forest being chased by a bear. But think about it. What is that like if the bear lives in your home? What if you're a little child and one of your parents is the bear? And when you come home from school every day, you don't know if that bear is going to be the teddy bear who's going to sweep you up and hug you, feed you milk and cookies and help you with homework, or if it's going to be the mean, nasty bear who's been drinking all day and ready to pass out and angry and is beating their spouse and might beat you as well, or maybe even end up in jail before morning. What is that like to live with that day after day after day? And what does that look like when you go to school? Think about it. If you're living with that kind of stress and you show up to school the next day, is your brain really going to be thinking on the lesson at hand, or is it going to be cycling thoughts about what is going on in my home? I'm so different from everyone else. I don't fit in. I'm scared. I hope this doesn't happen again tonight. And if you end up sitting next to someone who pokes you in a gesture, jesting way, are you going to just say, oh, please don't do that. Don't touch me today. Or are you going to haul off and punch them in the nose? If you don't like what the teacher says to you, are you just going to tell them, I'm sorry, or are you going to be defensive? Are you going to sit calmly at your chair if you get frightened? Or are you going to run and hide in the coat closet behind all the coats? Are you going to try to run away at recess? So these are some of the reactions you might have if you're in school, and you certainly are not going to be able to learn very well or do well on a test. So if your grades aren't doing well day after day, you're feeling more different than the kids as you are identified by the teacher and by the school and by your parents as failing, and then you feel like a failure. And all of this is happening because of what's going on in your life. I recently had a terrible trauma in the fall, and I will tell you, it set me back for a couple of months. And I realized as a result of that what our children go through, because as an adult, I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't want to talk to anyone about it. I just shut down. I didn't trust anyone. I didn't feel like I knew where to go, even though there were resources in my community and I was an adult and able to navigate those. And it really brought home to me what it would be like again to experience that trauma as a child, where you really have very little voice. You have very little control in your life. You're really dependent, but yet you still don't know who to trust. Who is a trusted adult that you can turn to? Where can you go for help? These things are often misrepresented and assigned as symptoms of disorders like depression, bipolar disorder, ADHD, all those things. And often it's just behavior that's come about because a child is experiencing trauma. So when we have a kid who's experiencing non-traumatic development, and you think of this little inverted triangle as their brain, in non-traumatic development, that child comes to school feeling safe and secure. They aren't spending time thinking about survival. They're really focused on learning and cognition and making friends and behaving in the classroom. But if they have trauma in their lives or trauma in their past, that learning piece and that relationship piece takes up the smallest part of their concentration. And most of their time is spent just trying to stay under control and keep from acting out. And they're thinking about everything through a survival lens. And then unfortunately, a lot of our policies and practices can compound that trauma. So this is a little boy from Springfield, Oregon, a story that was in the front page of the newspaper a number of years ago, Hunter Smello. He had a problem getting to school on time. And the 5th time he was late, the school said, you have violated the no tolerance policy for tardiness. You go into detention. So this kindergartner was placed behind the screen in the lunchroom, a big D on that food container for detention. And he was left there for the whole lunch period, isolated and picked out among his friends. He became very hysterical, and the school called his grandmother. And when she got there, she explained to them, Hunter loves school. It's the thing he looks forward to. It's the highlight of his life. But at home, there are problems. Mom and dad are divorced. His mother is chronically ill. He gets up early every morning and makes breakfast for himself and his little brother and sister. He helps them get dressed. He gets his mom up, gets her to the car, even though she is having trouble walking. She gets in the car and starts driving to school. But they have an old car. And the 5 times he was late to school, the car broke down on the way there, so he couldn't get there on time. So was it his fault he was tardy? It was not. When the community read this story, they really surrounded him with care, and they bought that family, I think it was a used van, but they bought them a new car and helped them. And it really just went back to the whole point of what is being trauma-informed. Trauma-informed changes the question from what's wrong with you, Hunter, to what happened, what's going on, how can we help, let's talk about this. And that is basically the tenet. When we all talked this morning about why are we here, we want to learn to be more trauma-informed. It's really looking beyond the surface behavior, beyond the response you might get from someone at the moment to say, hey, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there's something that happened to this person or is happening to this person. So that's kind of the immediate impact of trauma and stress. The intermediate is that childhood trauma interrupts our healthy brain development. And I've got this picture here of a tree that's thriving and then one that's been, has lacked the nourishment, the care, the water that it needed. And look at how differently they develop. And that's the same with childhood trauma. If you look in the upper right corner of your screen, there's a little picture there of illustrating synaptic density. So what that's basically telling us is that we are born with billions of brain cells when we are first born. And that's the number of brain cells we are going to have for the rest of our life, except as they die off. But what changes is the number of connections between the cells, the pathways that transmit those signals. And those connections, those synapses, grow and grow and grow through experience, so that by the time we're in elementary age, we have bazillions of these connections, these synapses and neurons that have developed, or not neurons, but synapses. And those develop until a stage where our body begins to prune them back. And what do we lose? We lose the connections that we don't use very much, and we strengthen the ones that we use the most. So think about that when you look at these two scenarios in these pictures here. The one at the top, this caregiver clearly loving on this child, holding him, the baby looks happy looking at him. And so let's ask ourselves, what is that child learning about people in authority, people who like parents, teachers, and so forth? Is he learning that he can trust those people, that they care about him, that they will be there when he needs them, that he has people he can turn to and that he can trust, that he'll be safe in the world when he goes out there because he can always come back to that person? And what's he learning about the world around him? Hey, the world is a safe place. It's a great place. I'm special in this place, and it's going to be fun and exciting to explore, because even if I get scared, this good guy is going to be there to hold my hand or help me figure it out. And what's he learning about himself? He's learning I matter. I have intrinsic value. I'm important. I'm capable. I'm just the world's most wonderful thing. So he's learning all of those things through his interaction with his primary caregiver and other caregivers in his life. Now let's look at the picture at the bottom. What is that child learning about his caregiver, adults in general, authority? He's learning they can't be counted on. He's learning they may let me down. He's learning they won't be there for me when I need them. their priority is going to be somewhere else. And what he's learning about the world around him is, it's not there for me. It's a scary place and no one's there to help me through this. So what's he learning about himself? I'm on my own. I'm not very important. I don't matter to anybody. I'm probably in the way because I need things that someone would rather spend their money on booze instead of on me. So I am low priority in people's lives. I have no value. The world's scary and no one's going to watch out for me. So now let's go back to that synaptic density diagram. What is being cemented into those children's brain and what is dying off? And that's why we say trauma changes brain development. It absolutely does. It further develops the parts of our brain built for survival. Our amygdalas are actually larger in a child that's experienced stress and trauma. They work differently. Their prefrontal cortex for thinking may be less developed, so they have less executive functioning and decision-making capacity. They can't think as rationally. They can't really follow what they need to do, directions and things like that. It actually changes the way that they think. And they're much more inclined to respond to everything through a fight, freeze, flight response. We can actually see that in the brain scans of children. So the PET scan down there at the bottom, the one on the left is a normal child that's had a good nurturing development. The one on the right is an abused brain from a child who grew up in neglect and abuse. And you can actually see the brains are actually a pound lighter in the abused brain than the healthy brain. Parts just absolutely do not even develop. So why does this happen? Well, here's what goes on. When we are at rest, our stress hormones are down into a nice level where we're not feeling them. We're not, like right now, I'm not feeling adrenaline rushing. I don't have cortisol, my stress chemicals, they are not taking over. But when a threat happens, like let's say an earthquake goes off at this very moment or something like that, I might go into my fight, freeze, flight response. My hormone levels are going to rise, not only adrenaline and cortisol, but also dopamine that's going to try to protect me from pain. In case I have to run and I break a leg, I'm not going to feel pain at that moment. I can keep on running because the dopamine being produced by my body is going to make me block that pain feeling. So all of those things, we also have oxytocin that will pump out at that time. And that's the one that makes us reach out for care, for connection with others. So I might get more oxytocin that will make me run to other people and take protection from them. So all of those chemicals are pumping out. But then when the threat goes away, those chemicals go back down and we go back down to a resting level. For someone who is staying in a high level of trauma and stress, those chemicals are going to stay higher and their body will get used to a higher allostatic fixed level of those chemicals. And over time, that takes wear and tear on the brain, the body. They're inflammatory. They can inflame our organs. They can make our heart beat harder. They can do all kinds of things, set us up for more heart disease and so forth. So that chemical soup really changes the way our body reacts. So what we see as the neurobiological effects of trauma is we have increased size of our amygdala, which is in our limbic system. We see more stimuli as fearful. We are more commonly in fight, freeze, flight. We have a higher startle response. We're more hypervigilant. We have more inflammation, higher blood pressure, higher resting heart rates, and so forth. We see a decrease in our ability to learn and remember things. We have fewer connections in our corpus callosum, which is in the cortex part of our brain. We have more difficulty remembering things and sequencing things. Our language skills are a little less. We have a hard time forming strong attachments to people or regulating our mood, because regulation, again, mood regulation comes from that amygdala and our cortex. And so if that's not working as well, we're not going to be able to regulate moods. So that's the intermediate response. The long-term response is that this is the part that really got me when I first heard this story about ACEs, was that the impact of childhood trauma is actually inheritable. And there's 3 different scientific explanations for what happens with that. There are some switches for certain disease states that are kind of an on-off switch. We've seen studies about that with stress and men and Alzheimer's that were done in Japan, where people living in stress or even environmental stress like toxic air can switch the switch on for Alzheimer's, but diabetes, our resting body weight, all kinds of things can be switched on and off. There's also the histone modification model, which talks, and the telomere shortening. So histone modifications are that little proteins will connect to the outside of our DNA and change how we respond and what disease states our body will be more prone to. And the telomere shortening models are Those are little hairy structures on the outside of our DNA, not the part of our DNA that changes the colors of our eyes, but the little telomeres will shorten, and that can also impact our health over time. So some of these things can be actually inherited from one generation to the next. And here's the crazy part. The little egg that formed that little baby there, the third generation, was actually forming in her mother's ovary while she was forming as a fetus in her mother's uterus. So the impacts of stress from the grandmother can be passed down all the way through to that grandchild, 3 generations. And so that's why we see generational impact sometime, and it can take a long time to heal from this. So when I first heard this story, I was sitting in a darkened conference room, and I just thought, I began to cry, actually. I started thinking about the multi-generational impact of trauma in my family, of the trauma of so many families where people were in World War I, or affected by the Great Depression, or in World War II, or affected by coming back into work after World War II with undiagnosed and untreated PTSD, and the impact on families and addiction and all kinds of things. And I just thought about that cascade of events and how it's affecting our world today. And I thought, if we don't start addressing this now, can we really wait 3 more generations? Because look at the impact this is having on our world today. Trauma is impacting families through divorce, abuse, neglect, abandonment, more kids in foster care and homeless. In our schools, we're hearing more and more. Every time I do a training for schools, they're talking about how the kindergartners and first graders are so violent today and getting, in trouble so much, and the teachers are quitting and turning over because they're burned out. In our work sites, we see more mass shootings going on, and people missing work because of presenteeism and absenteeism, aggression. We see higher workman's comp costs and more accidents on the workplace. In our communities, there's more unemployment and homelessness, more poverty, substance abuse. What is happening around us? And in our systems, this is resulting in increased costs and drain on our systems. Our jails are overloaded. Our ERs are to the max. In fact, we're diverting people all the time from our emergency rooms. Our schools are having continued problems, and we don't have enough mental health providers to meet the need in our community. We just can't wait. We can't wait to address this issue across our whole community. And so that's why our community here in Clark County is, in our public health program, is so devoted to really addressing trauma in every way we can, through policy, systems, and environmental change, and through education like this. And I hope you'll all take on these stories and share them with the people that you know. Spread the word. So I want to talk a little bit about we talked about stress and we talked about trauma. When you put that all together and think about it in a day-to-day perspective, and you're bringing that along with you, it's kind of your baggage you're dragging along, and then you encounter the stresses of every day. How do we kind of integrate all of that? So one way to think about that is as a window of stress tolerance. Here you have person A. They have a baseline of stress that's pretty low. Life is good, they can pay their bills, they're in a loving family, they had very little trauma in their life as a child. And then you've got person B, who's maybe having problems on the job. Maybe there's some struggles going on with one of their kids is getting in trouble at school. Maybe the dog is sick. So they've got a baseline of stress going on, and maybe they had trauma in their life to begin with. So their window of stress tolerance is already a little bit full. Now they both have the same breaking point before they're gonna just lose it, right? And flip their lids. But person A has a larger window of tolerance because they're not so filled up with their stress. Their mind isn't already further into the survival mode, whereas person B is already halfway in the survival mode just to begin with. They have a little less tolerance. So when we work with people that flip out a little faster than us, maybe just keep that in mind and say, hey, look, maybe they just have a smaller window of tolerance than I have today. Maybe they had a few things that happened on the way to work, like someone cut them off or they got an offender bender that's just put them over the top. So when we see a coworker or a client or a neighbor or a family member lose it, and it seems like, wow, I didn't even do anything. I just looked at you a little funny and you got mad at me. Just give them the benefit of the doubt. Think, where's their window of stress tolerance? What we know is that through trauma-informed approaches, through helping people learn more about themselves, for teaching them self-regulation techniques that we'll talk about later, and self-care, we can open that window and have people over time learn to enlarge their window of tolerance and learn how to reduce their baseline stress through self-regulation, through dealing with it. So that's kind of one of our goals for being more trauma informed, is really focusing on how do we increase our capacity to deal with stress on a daily basis. When we do receive stress, we go into a state called dysregulation. So regulation, when we're self-regulated, we are usually responsive, engaged, focused, and calm. We are functioning from that prefrontal cortex. Everything's in alignment. We're doing good. Our brain stem is not highly activated. It's doing what it's supposed to do, helping our heartbeat, and we're not frightened. We're regulated. We can focus. We can relate to each other. But if something happens that dysregulates us, we become either hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. If we're hyper-aroused, we become impulsive, aggressive, or we get agitated and argumentative. We might live in an anxious state where we're just like, can't calm down, can't focus, can't sit down. We become resistant to directives and authority. We might take risky behavior and engage in that to distract us from what's going on. We have trouble adhering to the rules, and we want to even break rules to kind of feel like we're in control. We want to yell, we want to threaten people because we're just so far into fight, freeze, flight. But there's another side to it, because we often think that that's the response when we're dysregulated. It isn't always the response. And particularly for women, sometimes a little bit more than men, but we also see this with boys and men too, especially for people who've experienced trauma where they felt hopeless and out of control. People will go into a hypo-aroused state because they'll go more toward dissociation. So those are people who will not show up for events, or they show up late all the time. They're absent. They say they forgot, and they forget all the time. They're defiant. They're forgetful. They forget to bring their paperwork. They forget to bring their change of clothing. They forget whatever it is. They avoid tasks. They avoid people. I found I was doing this as a coping mechanism. I would fill my calendar and I'd be so busy with work, so busy with commitments that I could not make time for friends or family. It was a dysregulation, hypoarousal state that I felt was okay to participate in. Was keeping my calendar so full I didn't have to see people, but it really was just a way of withdrawing from my peers. It was an excuse. These folks dissociate. They might just shut down and absolutely don't answer or say, oh, that's fine, whatever, I don't know. Or they might get to the point where they're actually depressed, crying, or sleeping all day. So these are the two sides of dysregulation that can happen. And dysregulation can be triggered not only by the main event, but things that will bring traumas back up to us. So that might be something like unpredictability. Someone who's grown up in a very unpredictable environment where trauma was something that they feared and that happened frequently, having an unpredictable schedule or not knowing what's going to happen the next day can be very triggering. We're an adoptive family, and my two children grew up in an orphanage for their first year. For my oldest daughter, that unpredictability threw her off track every weekend. During the school day, she knew what was going to happen, but she'd start in on me on about Thursday. What are we doing this weekend? What's our schedule? And it was because she needed that. She needed some kind of schedule for her to feel safe. So if you have clients that are coming to Family Promise and they don't know where they're going to be living, they don't know the answers to their questions, they don't know what the daily routine is going to be yet, that unpredictability can be very triggering. So anything you can do to help alleviate that is going to help them. A perceived lack of choice or control. When you have had little control in your life, or someone has dominated you, then losing that control again can really make you feel out of sorts and afraid. So giving people as much voice and choice as you can, empowering them to make as many decisions instead of doing for people. If they need to make a phone call, say, there's the phone, it's up to you to make the call. So giving people control and choice in their lives, or helping them think of what the choices are and then letting them make them, is really important as well. There can also be specific triggers that will remind someone of the trauma they experienced. It could be a date. Anniversary dates of traumatic events usually are very, very triggering for people. If there was a response by someone in uniform, whether it was EMS or a physician or a law enforcement person, that white coat, that uniform can be very upsetting to them. Again, I'll just use an example from my daughter. She couldn't speak yet because she was just a little child when I got her, but I put on a white bathrobe that was available in my hotel room after we got her. She took one look at me in that white bathrobe and it triggered a memory for her. And I later found out she had had months of medical treatments for a really severe problem she had that were very uncomfortable. And she related that white bathrobe to the white lab coat that people were wearing when they treated her in the orphanage. So those are really deeply seated memories and connections. Certain objects, colors, a time of day. If trauma always happened at sundown in your family, sundown might become a trigger for you. Attention that's unwarranted or even positive attention can be very upsetting for people, and they may not want to have their name called out or have their picture put up on a board or whatever it is. So you might always check with people if you're going to even give an award to someone of whether they're okay with that. Authority, again, can be very triggering. Seeing or hearing aggressive behavior, kind of like me in my meeting that I went to, can trigger you. Limit setting, having someone tell you what you can and can't do. Now let's think for a minute about a child who experienced trauma and they lived as kind of the surrogate parent, the surrogate head of household, even though they were only 11 years old. And they set the rules for the younger siblings, and they felt that they were in charge of helping to take care of mom in the household. When suddenly someone else steps in and starts to make limits or boundaries or give them rules, think about how they might respond. They may push back, they might fight back just because of the fact that you are taking away the control and the position that they've always had. They felt like if they weren't in control and responsible, things would fall apart. So it's not coming because they're angry at you for giving them some boundaries or some regulations. It's just that they feel that you're taking their control away from them and they need that for safety. So again, the more that you can help to empower people and give them that sense of control, the better. Discipline can be a situation, especially if we use traditional discipline, that can be very shame-based. Really a potential for losing connection and relationship, for losing possessions, for losing control. So we want to think about discipline, and this can be actual real discipline or just something where someone feels shamed or anticipates they might be disciplined. Isolation from others is a big trigger for regulation, because really what we want is to be connected to others, even if we have trouble doing it, like I might have from time to time. But that need for connection, to know that we're around someone who's going to care, someone who will keep us safe, can be very frightening. So to put someone in a timeout room, away and apart from others, or like they did to little Hunter, separating him by that divider in the cafeteria, that isolation, that sense of being all alone and different from everybody else, compounds that feeling of separation and embarrassment, neglect, and so forth. On the other hand, being too physically close to people can also be upsetting, especially for people who are highly sensitive. Sometimes having people brush up against them, feeling like everybody's really close and within my boundary that I need, can also be triggering. So you might want to ask people, if you need to touch someone, let them know that. So this is often true for medical providers, but also I find, when we want to give compassion to someone, maybe reach over and pat them, and say, it's going to be okay. You pat them on the shoulder, you take their hand, ask them first. Say, is it okay if I put my hand on your shoulder? Can I hold your hand? Are you comfortable with that? Don't hug someone without asking first, because that may be very triggering for them. Loud and abrupt noises can be very upsetting. Some of us are just highly sensitive to sound to begin with. And so having a lot of background noise and screeching can make it so difficult we can't even hear what's going on. Even a lot of other conversations going on can be very distracting if you're hyper vigilant and watching for trouble. But specific sounds like car noises, a loud sound like a gunshot, people yelling or screaming, hearing a siren in the distance, those things, dogs barking, those could be associated with the traumatic event. So just keep that in mind, and maybe trying to keep sounds pleasant and low for the guests in your family promise shelters can be a really wonderful thing. For others, and this is the hard part, when we talked about we're not omnipotent, we don't know what's going to be triggering for somebody. For some people, silence is triggering, very upsetting. They don't want to be alone with those thoughts. And when they hear it, they feel isolated. So how do we know? Maybe we just ask people, say, hey, do you prefer kind of noisy environments, or do you prefer quiet? And that way, maybe there's a way of setting up an environment, like in the day center. I noticed you have 2 different family rooms. Maybe there's a different kind of sensory situation in one versus the other. I don't know. That might be a possibility. Or just helping people to recognize what the sensitivities are of other people that are sharing the space. So again, some people are really get sensory overloaded. Some get overloaded by too little sensory stimulation. Crowds, and again, posters, images, or signs can be very distressing to us at times. So I'd like to take a few minutes before we go to lunch to talk about the effects of stress on communication, because I never realized how profound these are. But our stress centers really overwhelm us because, first of all, they take away that prefrontal cortex that allows us to be thinking, but also our hearing and sight areas are closely aligned to some of those brain structures and can be affected as well. So when we're in low stress, we can process an average of 7 messages in a given moment. But when we're in high stress, we can only process about 3. So think about a time when you were working with a client who was in high stress, or you were in high stress. Let's say I go to the doctor and I get, and I hope I don't trigger anybody, this is just a simulation. I get a diagnosis that's really scary of some disease that I've got. I have COVID, or I have cancer, or I have something. All of a sudden, my ability to remember what that doctor says to me goes from 7, I bet, to 0. I bet it's less than 3. All of a sudden, I can't remember what I'm supposed to do when I leave that office. I don't remember what he said. And to give you an example, my sister and her daughter and husband were dealing with a cancer diagnosis in their family. And they went in to meet with the doctor, all 3 of them. They had a recording device because I said, take it along because you probably won't remember. They recorded the interview and the discussion. When they came out, they all talked about it, and all 3 of them had a different perception of what the doctor said. And then when they played the recording back, all 3 of them were wrong. Nobody remembered it accurately. So that just kind of illustrates for us when someone's going through homelessness and they've got a lot of stress going on, they're probably not going to remember everything that you tell them. So having a written way to record it or a recording of something will help. Also, our recall of order is usually not sequential, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What we're going to recall instead is what they perceive as the most important thing or the last thing that is said to them. That's what will stick. So remember that if you give a lot of directions, they'll remember the last thing or the one thing that's important. We work at about an 8th grade level when we're in low stress situations, but we move down to a 4th grade level in high stress. And this is interesting to me. Our trust in others is built on competence and experience when we're not stressed. So we will turn to the person in charge, the manager, the doctor, whoever it is. But when we're in high stress, we don't really care what that person's position of authority is. We care about whether they are listening to us, whether they're empathetic to us and caring. And I used to always think that was interesting. My parents judged a doctor on their bedside manner. They were a good doctor if they listened to my mom and dad while they were dealing with medical problems. Now I understand why that was. It didn't matter how many degrees they had or where they got them from. It was whether they cared about them or showed the caring. So let's talk a little bit about the effect of trauma on language. First of all, we find that people who've had a lot of trauma and grown up in a lot of trauma may have a smaller vocabulary, first of all, and socioeconomic status impacts that vocabulary as well. We have fewer words if we've grown up in an impoverished home versus a well-off home, because more words are typically used in higher socioeconomic status, and there's more dialogue that goes on. But also the emotional language is less. We tend to lump together our feelings and not really learn to discern our feelings as different things. For example, my darling daughter, again, she's okay with this. I asked her if I could use her as an example, and she said, yes, absolutely. So when she was little, every emotion that we showed or that she showed was angry. She was angry, I was angry, everyone was angry. When in fact, we were embarrassed or offended, or we felt attacked or insecure or frustrated. And we had to work really hard to help her learn those other languages, those other words. So you might even want to put this up as a decorative poster in the day shelter or something to help people kind of understand. And for children, you can use, there are face diagrams that show different facial expressions and talk about the nuances of those. There's children's books that help teach feelings so that they understand that each feeling is a little different from every other one. They're not all the same. We also lose that language that helps us organize our thoughts or express ourselves. And if you've ever been in a really super stressful or traumatic situation, you'll find that your words come out as word soup. They don't even make sense. They just float around. You can't express yourself. Sometimes you can't even get the thoughts out. This year, when I was really traumatized by something, I started stuttering, which I'd never done before. But it's that verbal center gets kind of mixed up for us. So what you might do if someone's experiencing that is really consider what might be going on and check in with them about where they're at. Are they feeling mentally and physically safe, secure? Do they need a timeout? Use some reflective listening skills to make sure that they understand what you're trying to say and you understand where they're at. So that means ask them for clarification or say, what I hear you saying is, and do you have any questions? You can use nonverbal methods. Sometimes when people can't talk with their words, they can draw, they can use art. So if people are having, children especially, but adults as well, if you're having trouble getting your feelings out, turn to pencils, crayons, paints, glue fabric together, do whatever you can to express yourself. Even if you don't share it with someone else, just doing that for yourself can help you to start connecting with your feelings again. You can use contexts or clues or props like this poster or like other posters that are out there about feelings, or little books that you read together with children to understand your feelings and express them. And then using thoughtful hesitation is good. So when we're stressed, we might just immediately, we have trouble kind of reducing our immediacy of wanting to respond immediately. But being able to practice thoughtful hesitation, when you want to say something, you just stop for a minute and say, let me just think about it. Breathe, let you get yourself thoughts together, and then answer. And encourage your clients to do that. Say, you can take a minute to think about this before you answer, because you might have a lot of different thoughts that haven't even surfaced yet. You may want to collect those before we talk further. And then you can always take a break if something becomes really stressful and just say, let's get a cup of water for a minute and just take a little short walk. And we'll come back to this question when our minds feel a little clearer. There's also an impact on memory because chronic stress, especially from exposure to violence, can mess up our working memory and our ability to process information. So if you think about that, let's say this often happens with people who are at a crime scene, for example. The police will come in, ask them a bunch of questions, and they'll just be like, I don't remember. And then a month later, little visions, little memories will come back. They might be out of sequence. They might not make a lot of sense. They may not remember the exact details. They may not even remember, let's say they were in an accident while they were on a bicycle. Immediately after the accident, they may not even remember how to ride a bicycle, but it will come back over time with the right nurturing. So what you want to be sure of is that you and your client both feel safe and secure in your surroundings. And one way you can do that is if you, and we'll try to practice this today if we have time, but if you notice that your client is getting really stressed out in a conversation, take a breather and say, hey, you know what? I feel myself kind of going off into a different world here that feels more stressful. Let's bring ourselves back into the moment where we are safe together. Let's just press our feet into the ground and bring ourselves back that we're in this room. We're not in another place that we felt unsafe in. Let's look around the room and pick out things that are orange or red or green. So we're using our eyes to bring us into this moment. Let's tap our cheeks or pat our knees and say, my body's here. I'm here in this moment, in this presence. I'm safe and sound. What do I smell? What do I taste? What do I feel? And those things can bring us back if we've drifted off to some unsafe place that was triggered for us. You can provide people with reassurance and say, hey, I know you've been through a lot and sometimes it's hard to remember things. Don't worry, we have time. I feel patience for you. Another thing is to really connect with them. Make sure that they feel your relationship first. Relationships are always first in trauma-informed care or approaches. So get to know someone. And that's kind of what we were aiming at the beginning today, was forming that connection, a little bit of relationship by getting to know each other's names and where we were from, so that we felt more connected as we dove into some really difficult information together. But you can do that too when you have someone who comes to you and you really don't know them. You've got to now tell them where to put their belongings or give them the rules of the road. First, connect with them and let them know that you care about them and you're coming from a caring place. For children, but for adults as well, music can really help us to link to calm. And we find that swinging, repetitive motions can really help us to calm down. I have found going through stressful experiences that if I take up painting, I've painted almost every room in my house this year because the process of rolling paint on my fence or on my room is a very repetitive, kind of motion that helps to calm me, vacuuming. That's why I love to vacuum. Anything that's like that, swinging or moving to music and rhythmic motions can really help us to calm down. And if we turn information into music for children, they will remember things better. Checking for understanding again, making a recording or writing things down, having handouts or pre-printed brochures can help folks. And then recommend to people that they keep a calendar, or maybe Family Promise even provides a calendar or a scheduling tool so people can learn to track their appointments because they need to learn that. That's a life skill. And then following up, closing the loop later to be sure that everything is still remembered and that they're on track. We also have a problem with attention when we've experienced trauma. We have a really hard difficulty focusing because our mind keeps wanting to go back to that traumatic or stressful event, to figure it out, to dwell there, to process it, to feel it again and again and again. So there's that frequent downshifting. And we want to focus on survival first when we're a victim of trauma. We also may have a lot of hypervigilance and anxiety. We watch everything all the time to see, is there someone who's going to harm me that's going to walk into this room? Was that sound that I just heard something that I should be afraid of? And it doesn't, in that case, even matter necessarily that it's related to the trauma. It's just that our fight, freeze, flight is so on target right now, everything could be a little frightening. So what we might do with that situation is, again, establish safety, not only through what you say to someone, but be sure that they feel safe in the environment. As an example, one thing you could do is have some conversations with a group of people who participate in Family Promises program and say, when you came in through our entry program, was there anything that caused you to feel unsafe? I'll tell you, when they did that with Council for the Homeless, they found that the ticking clocks in their intake rooms really troubled people because it reminded them of time going by and that they were homeless and that their lives were speeding past. And so they removed the ticking clocks in their rooms and replaced them with silent clocks and put them where the person could look at the clock or not look at it, depending on what they wanted to do. In the jail, when they asked some of the folks who lived in the jail temporarily what was upsetting them, they said it was the keys jangling. And then when people got out of jail, they would hear people jangling coins or keys in their pockets, and it reminded them of that. And so in reentry, they work with the folks who help their reentry clients to recognize that some of those things can be triggers. So just be cognizant of that and think of, how can I create an environment that is soothing in colors, where the person doesn't have to sit with their back to the door because they may want to see who's coming in if they're feeling afraid that someone who could harm them might enter the room. Think about the introduction of pieces of nature into that environment. Are there plants? Are there rocks? Are there pictures of nature that someone could focus on to take a momentary brain break? Make it safe for them to say, I need a timeout. I need to just take a break and walk away. Maybe introduce movement into your meeting time with them and say, hey, here's what we do. We're going to talk about this first, and then we'll take a walk together so we can stretch our legs, and then we'll come back and sit down. Make sure that people are not hungry when they meet with you, because that is also going to interrupt with their attention. So having some tidbits out that they can munch on and feel safe with. So just checking to see, do I feel safe? Do I feel comfortable whenever you're working with someone who may have experienced trauma? And the same in your meetings. There are trauma-informed meeting guidelines that I didn't put that in the handout, but I can share it with you, that really emphasize a lot of those things, that really set the stage for feeling comfortable and safe and making it a pleasant place to be together. So trying to include some connection before and after the content that you provide is really a great way to really establish those relationships and keep that in mind first and foremost. And then pair your verbal instructions with some written instructions or recording reference materials, and help people to recognize, again, false positives. So that's what we talked to at the beginning. Make sure they know you're in a safe place here. You hear a dog barking down the street, that's just a dog. It's just a dog that's out there and safe. They're not going to hurt you, whatever it might be. I see some comments and questions are coming in, and I don't have my chat open, so let me take a quick peek at that. Oh, I can't. I have to change my screen, so I'll do that in just a moment. But let me go through and finish these last little ones we have here on impact on sequencing, which is, as we said, keeping track of time and time management really gets thrown out, because I will tell you, when you're really stressed, A few hours will feel like a few minutes, and a few minutes will feel like hours. It just changes our time sense, and it changes our ability to keep track of multiple steps. So what we're going to find is that people become more impulsive, they do things out of order, they forget what they're supposed to do next. And how can we help them with that? We can break our instructions into little chunks, and we can write them down. First you do this, second you do this. For children, you might have a little picture map of what they need to do. If you have a process, let's say where people are staying at your shelter and children need to do certain things in the day, maybe you create a little checklist that has pictures with it so that they remember, oh, first I need to do this, second this, if you have a certain guideline that they're supposed to follow for cleanup or bedtime or whatever. We sometimes need to talk about intermediate steps with people who've experienced trauma, and we might need to think about alternative steps, because folks who've experienced trauma tend to focus on the top of the mountain without thinking about how do I get there. So breaking down those intermediate steps so that they can feel successful at every step of the way is so important, and they may not think that. They may also think, I have only one pathway to the top of this mountain, and if I can't get through that pathway, I'm a failure, I'm done, I have to give up. Instead, we can say, hey, look, it's always good to have a plan B and a plan C, and there's no failure in taking those other ways. That's what makes you resilient, is having multiple ways to achieve your goal. So if your first way doesn't work out, that's not a failure. That means that you're going to try your second way of getting there. So that's something that a lot of people with trauma thinking don't always realize. It's important to have warm handoffs. So if you are going to have someone connect to a different service or to a new faith community when they move to a different place to stay for a while, be sure that you've prepared them with that, with the information they need, warm introductions, a way of the person they've learned to trust at this place now goes with them to meet the person at the next place if possible, because you want them to feel that safety and security is continuous, that they don't have to start all over again. Again, the calendar idea or a to-do list, sending reminders or written follow-ups or text messages, and then following up with them to make sure that they really got it. Are there any questions? Just want to be sure that I was really clear for you. You know, those kinds of things can really enhance that kind of safety. So I'm going to stop with these impacts on communication for a minute and come back to our, oh, there we go. Gwen, good point. HALT, make sure they're not hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Absolutely. Do you want to talk about that for a minute, Gwen?
Sure. That's one of the things that we talk about in the Rentwell class that we teach, which is teaching our guests and helping our guests become educated tenants when they're moving into their new homes. But I actually have been able to use that in any sort of conversations that they even have to have with their kids, or if they have to have an intense conversation with the boss. Just checking in. I mean, all the time when I have conversations with Dave, I have to make sure I'm not hungry. But one of those things is just and so you can also do the same if you are a volunteer and you're feeling very intense about some behavior that they have, or especially as we open up and you're back in your churches and, you know, maybe they're not treating it the way that you want it to be treated. Check in with yourself too. Are you currently hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Because then this is not the best time to have those conversations. So, and all of our guests are aware of that as well. So that's a really cool trick that I've really had great success with that.
That is great. I love that. HALT. I'm going to remember that. I wrote it down here in my notes. So thank you for sharing that. And I see Whitney shared the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding method. 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. I love that. Exactly. That's a great grounding method and is so important because we do spend, if we're trauma survivors, we do spend a lot of time going off into that other trauma zone, and that will help to bring people back and feel safe. So thank you for sharing that, Whitney. Says here, Lisa shared, nobody cares what you know until they know that you care. Absolutely. Maya Angelou, I think it was said, people will not remember what you say, they'll remember how you made them feel. That was what sticks in our heads, and that's why being trauma-informed, the most important thing. We can get to all the rest of it. It's how we help people feel, the relationship we set up. Dave asked, how can we give them control? So I think that that's a really good question that I would suggest one thing as a follow-up to these trainings is to form a group that wants to work together on this, that would involve stakeholders from your shelters, that would involve board members, that would involve families that have been in your service and that maybe are currently, and then maybe some community partners, to get together and talk about things like that. And we're going to be talking about the 6 pillars of trauma-informed organizations, and control and empowerment is one of those. And people will tell you, what can you do to help give me control? Sometimes it's something very simple. For example, in the sheriff's department, they realize they can't give someone they've just arrested control in a situation. There's certain things they have to do for their safety, and that's protocol. But what they can do is let the person in the back of the squad car who's under arrest pick the radio station on the ride to the jail. They give small pieces of control like that. Or which side of the car do you want to get in on? It doesn't matter if it's a big piece of control or a small piece. It's that you have some choices. It's that you have some sense of that. So there's ways that you could give control. I don't know. I can't predict for you, because that's a question that you need to discuss for your particular environments and the decisions that are allowable for families to make. But do you want to talk about it for a second? What are some ways that you could, it's 12, so we want to take a break, but let's think. Can anyone think of one way you could give a guest control?
We let our guests pick out their bed linens when they come in. So they come into our day center, and, you know, obviously the sheets are all the same, but we have a variety of comforters and quilts, handmade quilts from a couple of quilting groups in our community. And we ask them to choose them, and we let them know that they get to keep them when they leave as well, if they want to.
I think that's wonderful. You know, and I understand you all provide meals, is that right, for your guests? And maybe occasionally they can go out to eat. So that might be a choice that they want to make and really maybe need to make to feel a sense of control, is kind of directing what they need for their family at that moment, or what foods they really love or whatever, and still being able to offer good nutritious food and yet let them make their selections. Would be kind of one of the most basic areas of control we want to have in our own lives, is how to feed ourselves. So that's great.
Anita, I was thinking the same thing, because so often they get the same kind of food over and over again. And to just ask them, what would be a treat? What would you like to have? I think would be really important to pass that down for the rest of the week, that they at least have something that they enjoy and it's part of maybe their culture, or to try to create it as best to the culture that they, you know, so it's something that they can decide on versus just here's what your food is every night.
Absolutely. You know, my first lesson with that was working with clients who were receiving SNAP benefits. And when I saw someone had gone out and spent their SNAP benefits on a chocolate cake and shrimp and lamb chops, I was upset. And I went and talked to my manager about it. I didn't say anything to the client, but I talked to him and said, you know, they need their money. They should make it stretch further. And she said, you don't know what's going on in that person's life. Maybe that was more important than anything else for that particular day. They needed something to give them a lift. And so we don't judge, you know, just, so that was a good learning experience for me. And I think that we really can't. I mean, if we may want to counsel people if they're not able to manage their money a little bit, but ultimately having some choice is so important and good for people. I see other questions here about management for genetic predisposition, and I'm going to answer that in two minutes or less. And basically, we can't change people's genetic predisposition, but if we can identify that someone is more of an orchid than a dandelion, we can provide that person with more care, more resources, really understand that they're going to be taking things more sensitively, maybe need longer to process, maybe need someone they can talk to a little bit more, and are just going to have a harder time with some things. So, so that's kind of some of the things we can do. If we have a child who is extremely highly sensitive, my daughter was one of those people, really, and I am one of those people, really highly sensitive, where stimulation can really short circuit you. Just knowing and planning downtime into your day, or giving, you know, helping people learn some coping mechanisms, or even line up mental health supports can be helpful. Early intervention is important, absolutely. Ounce up prevention. And that's something else we can do too. And what we teach our teachers is attunement, where you kind of notice what things are dysregulating for your children in the classroom. And I think you could do that with fellow employees or board members or whatever, is noticing, gee, it seems like this person gets upset when such and such happens. So I'm going to notice when they start to exhibit symptoms of being stressed. And we're going to talk about that right after this break. We talked before we discontinued for lunch. We talked about kind of some of the ways that communication is impacted by trauma and stress. And now I want to talk a little bit about behavior may not be a choice. Behavior is not always a choice when we've developed a trauma brain. It really becomes our default. And so that means we're going to jump into fight, freeze, flight at the earliest possible moment when we experience any kind of stress or something we think will be frightening or dangerous. And what that will manifest as is any one of these things that you see on the slide here: inappropriate reactions, anger, aggression, clinging, being helpless, shutting down, non-compliance, lack of words. And so it's important that we remember that folks in stress are dealing out of that limbic system and that reptilian system. They have little control over that, because when your brain takes over under stress, it shuts down the thinking brain, and you don't control that. You can't say, I'm going to just go back into it. Your body's done this for a survival purpose. So that's their natural mode, is survival mode. And people will maybe even take traditional consequences as threats. So let's think about, you bring a family in and you're assigning where they're going to sleep for the night, and they may perceive what you think is going to be the kindest way that you could do something. They may, for some reason, find something about that as a threat, that they have to put possessions in a certain place, or they need to eat at a certain hour, or that they have to be near this other person, or whatever it might be. They may perceive that as a threat, even though you know that you're doing it for the right reasons, or these are your guidelines or whatever. So just keep that in mind, that they can perceive any kind of consequences, even good consequences, as possibly a threat. And they're always on that point for fight, freeze, flight. So let's look a little more deeply at the different parts of our brain and how these relate to trauma and stress. So in a brain state, we have our cortex. That's the thinking part, the gray matter around the outside. That's where we do most of our thinking and self-regulating and personality, relationship connection. And that's where we live when we're in a calm, alert state, when we're not afraid. We're up there in that part of our brain. But when we start to get a little nervous and a little alarmed at things, we start to move down in the brain into the limbic system. That's where amygdala and hippocampus is. I'll show you those in a minute. And then if we get more frightened, we move further down into our midbrain, and finally down into our brainstem when we're fully terrorized. And as we move further and further down in the brain, different parts of our body, different reactions become predominant. So let's take a look at that. The cortex, we do our higher thinking, planning, executive functioning, reasoning, our impulse inhibition, our social behavior and personality are up there in that blue cortex. So that's where we're going to try to live most of the time. And it is supported by those lower brain areas. So if we've underdeveloped our brain because we were living all the time down there in the midbrain and limbic system, our cortex is not going to be as fully developed, for example, to inhibit impulses. And it benefits by learning how to self-regulate and control the impulses that are coming from those lower regions of our brain. Now, as we start to get alarmed, the limbic system starts to react. So we have the hypothalamus, the amygdala, thalamus, and hippocampus. These control our memory, our emotions, our survival instincts, and they trigger the release of hormones such as dopamine and cortisol. And so what you might notice if someone starts to move into the alarm state, and I'd really try to keep these in mind, because these are what are going to tell you that someone's starting to get a little bit traumatized. You might see them start to pace. They might start drumming their fingers on the table. They might start to wring their hands. They can't sit down. They have to keep moving. Their legs are swinging. Their feet are tapping. They might have some tears that escape, or they might just start shutting down and they start staring or isolating themselves. So what you can do at that time is really do some parallel interactions, which are kind of modeling and mirroring. You can sit beside this person. You can give them some one-on-one attention where you check in with them and say, hey, do I maybe pick up on that something's causing a little anxiety, or not even name it, just say, hey, how's everything feeling? Do you need a break for the moment? Just show that you're caring and that you're still connected with them. And then keep them safe to someone where they will feel safe. Make sure their environment's safe and you're safe. Now, as they go a little further down, they end up in that fearful state and the midbrain starts to take over. And that's what controls our behavioral responses, how we hear things, our body movements, and the production of serotonin and dopamine, which are the pain masking hormones. So this is where we're really getting ready to freeze or fight or run away. So what you're going to see then is people might start developing more defensive behavior. They might get belligerent. They might start challenging you. They might start refusing to comply. So they're really starting to push back, becoming more resistant, or really shutting down or cowering or trying to overplease you at that point. And what you can do is just keep your cool, because no person who is stressed has ever helped another person who is stressed. All it does is magnify the stress. So try to keep your cool and stay calm. If you find it triggering for yourself, maybe reach out to someone else who could step in for you. So always keep that thumb on your own pulse first. You know, am I calm enough to deal with this? Is there something that's going to upset me just because of my own biases for this person? Maybe I'm not the right person if I have a particular bias about this group of people, or this way that this person communicates, or some of their behavior or something like that. Or if there's something in their behavior that is triggering for your trauma, you probably aren't the right person. Or if you're the, what was it, the halt person? If you are feeling hungry at that moment or just overwhelmed yourself, you will not be the right person to help that person calm down. So we have something called mirror neurons that pick up on other people's stress. And if that person feels you're stressing, it's going to magnify theirs and vice versa. So you may want to take a break or whatever. Then reassure safety. Let them know. We might do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 to make sure that they feel safe in the environment, or just do a check-in with them. And of course, preserve their dignity. And this is what I always share with folks who are teachers and others, is number one in trauma-informed approaches is preserve the dignity of everyone involved, for yourself and for all the people that you have connection with, including, oh, excuse me, how did this happen that people can get past your cell phone noise? So preserving dignity and treating everyone with respect, okay, a little extra patience. And then you can invite them. And I don't say tell them, because that can actually make it worse, especially if they're trying to, be resistant to direction. Instead, you would invite them and say, hey, I'm feeling a little stressed right now. Do you mind if we take a little walk while we talk? Or should we get a little snack? How do you feel about that? Or should we just get some crayons out and color while we're talking? Something, offer these things so that they don't feel that they've been told to do that. I don't think that you allow pets in the shelters, but that can be in other circumstances and situations a really nice thing. But for kids, having something soft, maybe they have a blanket, maybe they have a cuddly stuffed animal or something, but having something that they can stroke or hold on to. And for adults, that can actually be helpful too. And when we're super anxious, it can be really helpful just even have a pillow to hold close to your body and to hug. It can help you, or to rock. And you might encourage that. If you see people are really anxious, just say, give yourself a big hug and just do some rocking, and we'll rock together if you like. It's very soothing because it's that rhythmic exercise. And then finally, be empathetic, listening for their needs and enlist their help and give choices. The brainstem is all about motor function. So it's the part that we don't even think about. It regulates our breathing, our heart rate, our blood pressure, and digestion. And what you might notice are different things. If someone is going into fight mode, they might become very tense, very flushed or pale, very sweaty, staring, angry, twitching, clenching, moving in, getting aggressive, raising their voice, swearing. But if they're going into flight mode, you may see them walk or turn away from you. They may not show up. They might get up and leave the room. They might lose their papers, not seem interested, say they don't know, don't care, don't answer. Or one I'd never thought of until more recently is that they might use a lot of joking, talking in a baby voice, or distracting everyone from the issue at hand because they're trying to avoid, they're trying to run away. And then freeze would be to withdraw altogether from the conversation and shut down, become very, very over compliant, where they just don't want to draw attention to themselves, just only answer yes or no to your questions, or not answer at all. And they just look exhausted and worn out and like they've given up. So in that case, when we go into our brainstem, words aren't going to do it. So if you try to use words and say, hey, don't worry, you're in a safe place here, those words are not going to register for them. They are in a motor state now. So when they're this upset, they really need to move. They need to get up and move their bodies. So the first thing you want to do is think about safety. if you see someone get to this point, because you don't want to engage someone who might be in a real fearful, super terrorized state. So stay safe, maybe call in for a backup from a partner or coworker. And then again, stay calm yourself, because the more you raise your voice or get upset, the more they will. So let them vent. Just, I hear you, tell me more. I'm hearing you. Sounds like you're really upset right now. You know, just mirror back to them, acknowledge their feelings, let them speak. And then keep your distance. So you don't want to, at this point, be moving in to hug somebody or to put your hand on their shoulder. You want to really keep a little space and remember what we talked about earlier about communication and trauma. They don't hear much, if anything. So if you're going to give directions, keep it short. Things like stop or wait a minute. That's about it. Just those kind of short sentences. Sit down. So keep it short, and then remember that you've gone into that brainstem. So it's really primary somatosensory things. So you want to really move into the rocking and swinging, balancing, stretching. Those are the kinds of things that will help someone calm down when they're really in this difficult moment. And they may need to scream. Maybe they're really upset, and the best thing for them would be, hey, if you feel like screaming, let's just step outside and go ahead and let it out. You know, sometimes we just got to do that. One thing you can do to try to get them out of that mode is to engage their cortex. And remember, I told you can't think while you're in the brainstem. Well, vice versa, you can't stay in the brainstem if you come back up here. So you can start asking them information. If they're getting really upset at any of these points, you can bring them back up here by asking things like, oh, hey, wait a minute, tell me your address again. Or what was your birth date again? Something where they have to think about numbers or do a math problem. For a kid, we'll say, you know, can you sing the happy birthday song? Or let's count backwards from 10, whatever it might be, name the presidents. Those things are going to bring them back up here and help them move back out of that the lower parts of their brain. So those are, and then change the subject. One of the things that you might do if you've got someone that's really heading into a crisis kind of situation is just say, you know, here their backs against the wall, they're getting mad, and you say, hey, I've got a couple of ham sandwiches in my lunch. Do you want one? Or, you know, I really like chocolate chip cookies. Do you like chocolate chip, or do you like, you know, snickerdoodles? But you just completely change the subject and get them off course. And that's one way to kind of redirect and calm down, start something where you can actually even joke about things in a way. So that might be helpful. I'll share with you that one of the school districts recently, instead of going into restraints, which they used to use for kids who had become combative, they put them in restraints and kind of make it so they couldn't move. They decided instead to put the adult into a protective vest like they do in like Krav Maga and karate. So they grab their protective vest and they put it on, they let the kid go ahead and punch and kick, because that kid is so far into that they can't necessarily stop it. But they said with that padded thing on, they said usually they all end up laughing, and the child gets it out and they think it's so ridiculous that it actually changes the climate of the situation. So I'm not suggesting that you all get foam vests and start encouraging people to fight, but I'm just as an example of understanding how this can play out. So I want to come back to how we respond from trauma and stress. And the fact is that both children, and we see it often in kids, but also adults, we behave because we're afraid. We're afraid of exclusion or rejection. We're afraid we're going to lose people's love and affection and be isolated. Or we feel we are afraid for our safety. And that doesn't have to be real safety. We're maybe not in real danger, but if we perceive something because of the links in our hippocampus, we might think we're in danger. Or we're really afraid of failing or being ashamed or embarrassed. And those are natural reactions for anybody. But if you've experienced trauma and adversity and a lot of shame in your life, you are really going to be afraid of those things. So if we think about this, also, I just want to make a point of this. So often for adults, if someone is really feeling traumatized, we will take a break and say, you know, do you want to go ahead and take your trip to the restroom and collect yourself? Or why don't we take a trip to the water cooler and have a glass of water? So we give grace to adults, but I just want to make a point for children that we don't often give that same grace to kids. And we expect when they're in a situation where they're feeling really super stressed, out of control, or in danger, we expect them to still stay sitting at their desks in school with their feet on the floor and behaving the rules. And think about that. We wouldn't do that to an adult. We would give them a little space for that usually. So I think being trauma informed with regards to children is treating them with the same dignity and respect we would treat adults. And so I just want to put a little plug in for the case of kids. So our behavior can be a true symptom of trauma. And what I want us to all start thinking about is how behavior, even unwanted behavior, can be an opportunity to connect if we see it through a trauma-informed lens, rather than a source of something that should be shamed and disciplined. So our traditional strategies for dealing with unwanted behaviors from people is usually things like consequences that are negative, shunning them, shaming them, taking something away, corporal punishment, isolation. And think about that. If you've experienced those as a child or as an adult, did those things really help to cement your relationship with the person who was imposing those responses? I don't think so. I mean, you may learn to say respect. Well, yes, you might learn to comply. Those kinds of strategies will get compliance. You will get the behavior you wanted, but it will put a little dagger in your relationship, and it will change the way you think about yourself and others. And it won't really help the long-term outcome because nobody really learns from it. So trauma-informed strategies actually put the emphasis on relationship building first, rather than just getting the behavior we want and compliance. So the first thing we do when there's behavior we don't like is to think about what's the story behind this behavior. If someone's fighting me, are they thinking that they're really fighting for their survival? Like we talked about the person who'd been in control in their family situation, and now they felt that that was jeopardized, and they're still fighting for control because they feel if they're out of control, the family could fall apart. So it might be a survival need. If they give up, it might be because they're so afraid of embarrassment, they'd rather give up first than try and fail. If they're feeling ashamed, it might be that inside they're blaming themselves, or they've always been blamed, or that's kind of the role they played in their family, was that they were the ones who bore the shame and blame for everyone. If they're fear of failure, they might be defiant again. They don't want to start, or again, they're afraid to lose control. If they're just resigned and say, well, okay, whatever you say, I'll do it if you say so, that may just be that they're hopeless, that they just feel like there's no control. And we might see that for someone who had no control in their abuse as a child. And finally, just giving up or labeling you or themselves as a loser, saying, I'm just a loser. I had a relative who had an addiction issue a few numbers of years ago, has been very successful in following the path of AA. I'm so proud of this individual. But every time that we talked, this person would put an L on her forehead and just say, I am such a loser. I'm such a loser. And this is what she said all the time to herself. And so to be able to get to the point where she could seek recovery really required a change from that. So that's really indicates that person's given up and labeled themselves. We are not losers. Nobody's a loser, right? So another thing that we can do to be really trauma informed and help folks who've been down this path was demonstrated by another study by my buddies. They really aren't my buddies, but I have met them, Dr. Folletti and Dr. Anda. They did another study with their original participants where they looked at the numbers of those participants who had high visits to the emergency rooms and high visits to doctors' offices, who were coming back all the time. And then they did this amazing thing. They just asked them at one of their doctor visits, they said, how did that traumatic experience affect you later in life? And when the person answered, they did something just overwhelmingly different. They just stopped and listened. They didn't try to solve the problem. They didn't refer them to resources. They didn't redirect them. They didn't try to cheer them up. They just stopped and listened. And they found as a result of that, there were 35% fewer primary care visits to the doctor, 11% fewer emergency room visits by those individuals, and 3% fewer hospitalizations. The conclusion they drew is that really, we just need to be heard sometimes. We don't necessarily need to have all our problems solved. We just know somebody cares enough about us, that we matter enough to have someone who will listen to us. So when something does go wrong, when there's a behavior or an issue that comes up, being trauma informed really changes our question that we might usually ask when someone's done something that's offended us or that we don't like, where we would say, why did you do that? Now, let me ask you, if I come to you and you have driven my car out and bumped the fender, and I come to you and say, why did you do that? How does that make you feel? Anybody want to suggest your feeling in response?
Accused.
Accused. And what position does it put you in?
I mean, I don't think I can actually explain. I have been asked that question in different contexts, but what I remember most vividly is when my parents would ask me why I did something, I guess that was inappropriate, I will say, as a child. And they insisted on being answered, and I didn't know. I literally couldn't tell you. And it makes you feel like, shut down. You can't, kind of worthless and dumb, and you're blaming yourself. And that's a terrible place to be.
Yes, it is. Your back's against the wall when someone says this. They want a reason. And so all of a sudden, what are you going to do? Are you going to turn against yourself and say something like, well, I'm just inherently a bad person? I mean, that's not the answer. And so you become immediately defensive. You feel on the spot. You feel triggered, then your trauma is going to grow and you won't be able to think even further when you're asked to justify, why did you do something? So instead, being trauma informed will change the question more to like, oh, I see something went wrong. Tell me what happened here. Tell me what happened. Joey and Johnny got in a fight and Johnny punched Joey and now Joey's got a bloody nose. So tell me what happened and then let them each speak and tell their side of the story. Tell me how it happened might be another way to say that. And how did this affect your relationship with each other? How do you think this person feels? How do you think that person feels? How do you feel? So let's talk about our feelings. How did this affect how we feel about ourselves and each other? And then how can we repair this? What can we do to fix this situation? And that might be something that has to come back and talk about at a later time, but repair is really important. Now, if you were to compare having your toys taken away or being locked out of the shelter or, I don't know what the consequences are that you impose on people if they break the rules, but if you have those kinds of disciplinary rules versus a discussion more like this, well, tell me what happened, how did it happen, how did it affect our relationship, and how can we fix it? Which one do you think is going to be a little bit more positive, more intrinsic value building, deepen the relationship? I think the answer is probably obvious. So that's why I want you to think a little bit more about that. So we call some of this, we have a term for it, restorative practice. And we're doing this a lot with our juveniles in schools and our young people in schools. The schools have adopted this approach. A lot of our youth courts are adopting this approach. And the way it works is first step is when there's something that happens where someone's broken a rule or they're in trouble or they got real mad and they hurt the relationship, first thing to do is to regulate. So remember, you need to step away somehow and just come back later when you're both calm. With children, we often use a nonverbal response because trauma affects our ability to communicate verbally, right? So instead we use something called the brain in the hand tool. Have you all heard of that before? Anybody? Yes, I see a couple nods. So this was taught by Dr. Dan Siegel. And the idea behind it is that you use your hand to represent your brain. So here's your brainstem, your wrist. Your thumb is your midbrain and limbic system, your amygdala, your hippocampus, all that's here in the middle. And then here comes your cortex down over the top. And when you're fully regulated, you're kind of like this. You're all just nicely folded under. But when you get upset, you flip your lid. The prefrontal cortex is, there it is, no longer accessible. And you're functioning from down here in the midbrain and the brainstem. So for kids at school, we teach them that. And when they really can't talk because their communication skills are interrupted because of stress, they can just give the teacher this hand signal that my lid is flipped right now. Well, when you have two people whose lids are flipped, you aren't going to communicate at all. You are going to bounce. You're going to call names. You're going to get angrier and angrier. You're not going to help the situation and you're going to hurt the relationship. So it's best at that time to move away, take that break and let that prefrontal cortex come back down into position again so you can come back and talk to each other and work out a solution. So breathing, calming down, and then come back together. And when you do come back together, relate to each other first. Don't just dive right into the situation and what went wrong and what's the matter with you and all of that kind of stuff. Instead, we want to say, you are really important to me. And no matter where we go in this conversation, I want you to know it's our relationship that matters the most because I care about you, you care about me, we're putting that first. Then move into the reasoning and go through those questions we just talked about what happened, how did it happen, what were our feelings at the time, and then move on into repair. How can we fix this? How can you make amends? How can I make amends? What do we do to keep it from happening again? So that is what we're recommending as a trauma-informed way of handling discipline or problematic situations. So that's the problem. Now let's start talking about some of the answers in terms of an organizational perspective. And I'm going to share a little, the answers are realizing, first of all, that trauma can affect anybody. We don't come to school, we don't come to a shelter, we don't come to work wearing a big giant T on our t-shirts that says, I've experienced trauma. So we don't really know who else had trauma. We have to be able to treat everybody as if they potentially had trauma. And when we do that, we treat everybody well. So it's kind of like universal precautions in healthcare, where we just assume that everyone may have been in contact with someone who had like COVID or something. So in the hospital, we would wear gloves and masks and practice procedures of staying away from body fluids. It's the same thing with trauma-informed care. We just assume that trauma could have happened to anyone. So we want to remember all the time, trauma survivors may be in fight, freeze, flight mode. They may be super sensitive to triggers, that those triggers could restart all of their trauma and stress response. And there can be things in their environment that cause them distress and make them feel unsafe. And that physical, emotional, mental health can result from this over long-term time. So we want to really stop that, especially for kids, but for anybody, so they don't go there. And that anyone who's had trauma really needs a mentor or supporter to guide them and help them. So the 4 R's of a trauma-informed organization are realizing trauma is widespread, learning to recognize those signs and symptoms like we talked about a bit earlier, responding through integration of this knowledge into our policies, our practices, and our procedures, and then resisting the re-traumatization of ourselves and others. So the 4 R's, that's it. It's real simple, honestly. And we have some key principles. So there's 6 of these. There's 4 of those and 6 of these. And these actually came from SAMHSA, which I am not going to try to remember what SAMHSA stands for. It's the Society for Mental Health Services. It's a government agency about mental health and addiction. And so they have got a wealth of information on their site if you want to go there. But they have defined the 6 principles that most of us, most organizations have adopted to be trauma informed. And those include safety, and pay attention to these because we're going to have a moment in a bit where you can talk about this, but safety in your environment. What creates safety? Well, instead of doing it in groups, let's talk about it in a big group. Can anyone think of something that would make you feel safe in your work environment? Or in a shelter? How would you feel safe?
So in our, we took a Family Promise National webinar on trauma-informed day center. And one of the things that we learned was our day center has a lot of very old, it's from 1937, it's old. And it has a lot of big, heavy wooden doors, and there were no windows in these doors. So you never knew what was on the other side of that door. And, you know, you could be walking down the hall and boop, a door, you know, just pops open. And, you know, if you're kind of tense or stressed out, that surprises you. So what we did was we cut windows into all of those doors and installed windows so that you can actually see into every room except for the nursery. That's the only one room that you can't see into.
Wow, that's really cool. So that's a perfect example. The chairs with their backs to the door. There's a lot of different things, not knowing who is in the room next to you. So wondering if you're sharing a bathroom with the family that's in the next room, who are these people? And, you know, are they going to come and get me in the night? Or where are my possessions? Are they locked up and safe? And all of these kinds of things. What's my day going to look like tomorrow? So environmental safety, personal safety. And for employees, it can mean some things like knowing that that if I get sick, I have benefits to cover my family's health care, knowing that if I have to bug out for something because I'm not feeling well, I'm not going to lose my job. It'll still be held for me tomorrow, that the policies are well known and reviewed with my manager. So those are things that can also establish safety. And then trustworthy and transparency. And that's where letting people know ahead of time so that they can feel like they've got a predictable schedule for the day, that they know where things are going, that they know what's going to happen, what the consequences are if they don't meet their behavioral expectations. And I want you to think, sometimes when I talk about trauma-informed discipline, people think that trauma-informed means anything goes, that there's no rules and we don't we don't hold people accountable. That's actually not the case. We all have to be able to be accountable and responsible. I prefer the idea of responsibility over accountability. But as adults, we have to be responsible for our actions, for meeting people's expectations, for all of that. And we may need to provide a little extra guidance to folks who've experienced trauma, but we don't forget that fact. It's just a question of how we go about helping people learn that. Rather than punishing, we take more of an educated approach of discipline, meaning disciple or student. So we're going to teach responsibility rather than pounding it into somebody. So so having rules, having them posted, make sure that they're really clear, that people understand them, that they can ask any questions. If they need to make an exception, that maybe there's a way to go back and forth on that. So that's trustworthy and transparency. Peer support and mutual self-help. I think that's amazing. So having volunteers who can mentor each other and peer with each other, having an employee and a volunteer work together, having family members help each other across families, having other community partners that will help you. Having that peer support and having people learn how to help each other and depend on others is critical. And then there's collaboration and mutuality, which is that we would work together and we would all benefit for everyone. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So giving people the power and the voice, like we talked about before, is what do you need? How can you do this? And not doing it for them. So I'm sorry, I get a little distracted. My darling daughter keeps calling and calling and calling, and I'm hoping nothing's wrong, but we'll take a break in a minute and I'll find out. But anyway, so giving people as much voice and choice as they can. And then finally, keeping an ear to the cultural, historical, or gender issues that can come along in people's baggage. And I heard from David and the staff that you guys will be doing some additional training on equity and some of those questions. But I think that that's really important because those are things that are just with us deep in our hearts. So we need to think about how we might be retriggering some of that trauma. So we're going to watch a quick little video here about trauma-informed organizations. And I want to share with you that there is a bit of an accent in this little fellow. So hopefully it won't bother you. I find the UK has done a great job with videos. So he's going to talk a little bit about what's a trauma-informed organization. And hopefully y'all can hear this. It's not started yet, but. There we go.
He would come into my room.
Can you hear it?
He said
Okay.
I made him do it, and that it meant he loved me. It always made me feel powerless.
Yeah, we can hear it.
I never knew when an argument would turn into a fight. I was always scared, always on edge, always had to be ready to defend myself.
My late husband was very controlling, always put me down, told me what to wear or cook. He'd get angry if I didn't do things right. I had no choice or control. It made me feel useless.
Oops, sorry.
I had no confidence in the end.
So I zoned out, pretended it wasn't happening. It's so difficult to trust people now. I just freeze and float away in my head when I feel powerless.
Now I just get angry a lot, feel like I want to fight. Sometimes I worry I'm just like him.
I find it difficult to do things myself, and I get really nervous when I have to talk to new people. I avoid them when I can.
What we went through was traumatic because we were harmed physically, emotionally, and felt like we were in real danger.
Traumatic experiences can be things that happen once, a serious accident or assault.
Oops, sorry, I did it again.
Or it can be where traumatic things keep happening, like physical or sexual childhood abuse, or domestic abuse, or relationships where you can't be yourself, where you're put down or bullied.
It can make you feel powerless, trapped, or betrayed. The sense of confusion, shame, or fear can be overwhelming, especially if there is no one you feel able to tell. even after it's over, it's harder to get on with life and feel safe.
Trauma is more common than most people think. Almost 1 in 5 adults has experienced physical or sexual abuse in their childhood.
And more than a quarter of all women have experienced domestic abuse.
Some people recover after traumatic events. Some people aren't affected as much. Having good, safe, supportive relationships with other people can really help. But lots of people continue to be affected by trauma, sometimes long after it happened.
For most of us, traumatic or adverse childhood experiences like these affect our body's response to stress, affecting our physical health as well as our mental health. The impact of trauma can also make it harder for us to learn and to realise our full potential.
One of the most worrying things about the experience of trauma is that it can make us avoid people and places, even if they are there to help, like doctors, teachers, social workers, carers, colleges,
councils, community centres, employers, advisors, because most trauma experiences happen in relationships with other people. We can find it difficult to trust people or feel safe. And sometimes the way we react to help ourselves feel safe pushes people away and makes it even harder to get the help we need.
It's like our brains learn survival tricks to get us through the trauma at the time, like priming us for danger,
making us run away,
shutting down when we feel upset.
It might look like we have a short fuse, like we're unfriendly, or we're just a bit absent.
Anything, however small, that reminds us of that trauma can set off our own unique trauma response to protect ourselves, making us avoid the people and places that we need the most, like you. But there are things you can do to help me trust you enough so I feel safe and I don't shut down or avoid you. You can offer me a different relationship that doesn't remind me of the one I had when I was a kid. One where I feel safe, I feel empowered, and I have choice and control over what happens to me. One where we work together and I can trust you. This is called being trauma-informed in the way you work.
Being trauma-informed means thinking about what will make me feel safe. It might mean offering me choice over the sex of the person offering me care or support, especially if it involves intimate care or examinations.
Unfortunately, your usual care worker Heather's off sick. We'll be sending someone else instead. Do you have any preferences about who comes instead?
Well, I'd feel more comfortable with someone I've met before. Most importantly, I'd like a woman.
Well, how about June? She's worked with us for 3 years. If there's anything you'd like her to do that Heather normally does, just ask.
Trauma-informed means empowering me to have control and take an active role in what happens to me.
But we know some people don't like coming to the dentist, so is there anything that you're worried about or scared of? I can tell you each step I'm doing, so there are no surprises if you'd like. If you need me to stop, how will you tell me?
Trauma-informed means helping me to trust you by being clear about what will happen, doing what you say you will do when you said you would do it.
Unfortunately, our advisors are running about 30 minutes late. I'm so sorry about that. Are you able to stay, or can we make another appointment for you?
Many of us at work will have had our own experiences of trauma in our own lives, or we might witness or hear about it in the course of our work. So the same principles apply to all of us. We all need to take care of ourselves by making sure we're safe and connected to the people and activities that matter to us. Can you think of anyone you've met or worked with recently that a trauma-informed approach would have made a difference to? Are there any trauma-informed changes you might make that could make a difference?
So if you offer me safety and choice, if you collaborate with me and empower me and help me trust you, then you will help me work with you. Even if I only meet you once, even briefly, you can give me a different kind of relationship, one where I feel valued and valuable. connected, and safe.
And when that happens over and over again, with everyone that I meet, I can learn that it's safe to make connections with people.
It is those connections that we all need to access life chances and reach our full potential.
Okay. I hope, let's do a quick check-in. Was the audio okay on that? Because I couldn't adjust. It was okay? All right, good. So I think that that allowed us to hear a lot of the same things that we've been talking about in our previous conversations. And so I was going to do a little check-in and have us do some group work, but I think what we'll do is hold this conversation till later and come back to it as we apply all of what we've learned today. So we'll just put a little marker here into thinking about ways that we could implement some of those pillars into the work at Family Promise. I really also liked this gentleman's approach to being trauma informed. So this is a very short little 4-minute video that I'm going to share with you. And hopefully he's kind of a light speaker, so you might need to turn up your volume on this one.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Today, I thought we would talk about the big question, what it really takes to become a trauma-informed organization. And I think my answer is actually quite different from what other people say, because I think other people focus on what actions should be taken, what needs assessments need to be done, or what services need to be put in place. And for me, I think that the most important thing is the moment when a person is about to become trauma reactive and how well everyone else can handle that situation without becoming trauma reactive themselves. Because what I've learned from doing interviews of offenders or students or anyone who uses these trauma-informed organizations is that the most important thing that makes or breaks a person's day is actually the moment-to-moment interactions with people. And people as random as like the lunch lady in the cafeteria who will give you a full serving of food or not, just based on whether or not they like you and how they feel that day, or whether or not a safety officer will use excessive discipline just because they're frustrated with you. Those little moment-to-moment things are really what make people feel safe in their environment. And what I don't get is that the hospitality industry completely understands this. Every 5-star hotel or 5-star restaurant knows that service is the foundation upon which the whole experience rests. And so I really think that trauma-informed organizations need to take a hospitality mindset. And what hospitality means in a trauma-informed organization, I think, is that you're always being sensitive and attentive to the other person's needs and sensitive to their trauma reactiveness and the fact that you yourself can be trauma reactive and that you have to always guard against going into survival brain yourself, and to amp up as much as you can your ability to stay clear, to stay purpose-driven and goal-directed and emotionally attuned to the other people. Okay, so then the first step in learning how to do that is actually to understand what your own survival brain looks like. Now, for me, I know that when I get into survival brain, if I'm going into the aggressive mode, then I think people are stupid, that they have bad intentions, that they don't mean well, that they're only doing things to hurt other people. And then whenever I go into the withdrawal phase, I just want to give up on a project, give up on the people, think that they're never going to change. So when I realize that I'm in that alarm state, the first thing I do is just to slow things down as much as possible. Because I know that my body's been activated and I have adrenaline rushing through me and I'm feeling intense feelings. And there's no way that I can just snap out of it. I have to let my emotions and my body cool down on its own. So I have to have a lot of patience for myself. I also try to scan my body and get grounded in it again. And I try to take some deep belly breaths and take control of my breathing again. And the other really important thing to do is that I try not to get mad at myself for getting into that alarm state. Because I know that my alarm has only been activated because something really important to me is going on. Or because I feel like something that I really care about is being threatened. And then once I do that, I try to figure out what page I'm on. And PAGE is an acronym that I just made up that I think captures the essence of how to de-escalate from an alarm state. And the first step of PAGE is to really remember what my purpose is. And by purpose, I mean my purpose in life, and the kind of life I want to live, and the values that I uphold. And then I try to remember how this moment can be a moment when I'm trying to live my purpose in life. And then the next thing I do is try to figure out whether I'm being emotionally attuned to the other person. Because as alarms go up, then self-absorption kicks up. And I'm only worried about how this person's trying to attack me and whether I'm getting my needs and opinions across. And so this really helps me to slow down and pay attention to what's going on in the other person. And the next thing I do is to ask, what's the goal or intention of our meeting, this interaction, or even this very moment or this conversational turn? And when you're in an alarm state, you forget what the goal is and all you care about is self-protection. But if you remember what your goal is, then that can help you to stay focused on what you really want to accomplish and what you want to say and do. And then finally, I ask myself, what am I really feeling? And oftentimes the only things I can understand are the anger and frustration. So I have to dig a little deeper and ask, what is the hurt or the vulnerability that I'm feeling that I really don't want to express to the other person because I'm feeling threatened? And then I try to reorient my stance to express that hurt and vulnerability and feel confident that that's the only way that I'm ever going to get anything accomplished. And what I really want to say is that being in this clear, calm, purpose-driven state of mind is incredibly difficult, and it takes hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice. I think of it like being in great cardiovascular shape if you're an athlete, because you can learn a lot of techniques for being trauma-informed, and that's like learning the actual skills of your game. But to actually be able to execute all those techniques, you have to be in great physical shape. And to do that, you have to run miles and miles every day, and you have to keep training, and you can never let that cardiovascular endurance slide, or else your game just suffers. So this is really the most foundational, most important thing that people need to learn to become a trauma-informed person, and then to help your organization become trauma-informed as well. Now, after you've done this for 100 hours of practice, then you can move on to some of the techniques that we'll go over in the next videos. Thank you.
So there you go. If you want to hear what happens in the next videos, that's Jacob Ham, and he's on YouTube. So you can look him up. But I liked his approach, was a little bit different than just thinking about the safety empowerment pieces, a little bit more personal to how do I keep myself regulated and focused on my purpose in life as I'm thinking about helping or working with others. Just a little bit of a different take, but kind of similar results. So let's move on. So we're going to have a little brain break, but it's 1:30. Who needs a little break for just a moment? We're just doing a focusing break, or can we keep moving? Because we've got just a half an hour left. Are we okay to keep moving? Okay, I want to be sure you all know that you are empowered to make the choice to take a break if you need one. So run off, get a drink and come back, or take a bio break, whatever is needed. We're going to keep on trucking here. So the 4 R's were realize, recognize, stop retriggering, those 4 R's that we talked about. I would like to add a 5th R that they don't talk about in the literature, and that is resilience, nurturing resilience, because I think especially when you're working with families that have experienced homelessness and the stress and trauma and strife that goes with that, they may need a little help for that to really move that forward. And at the risk of this is a great little video, but I think we've done 2 videos, and I'd like to come back to it if we have time at the end today. If we don't, you can look it up on YouTube under Alberta Family Wellness. They have a lot of great resources about being trauma informed, but we may be able to come back to this toward the end of today's presentation. But it just talks about how we build resilience and how we create those additional brain connections that help us to be stronger. Stop that now. It's kind of a cute little thing, but I'm going to talk instead about the 3 keys to resilience. I kind of think about the precursors to being resilient falling into these 3 kind of buckets: attachment and belonging, capability, and community, culture, and faith. And you can see how the 7 C's of resilience that we talked about at the beginning of today's episode are across the bottom down there: the connection, confidence, and character, coping, competence, control, and contribution fit into these. So let's first talk about attachment and belonging. We get our original attachment and belonging through relationships. And if they come from family bonds, that is the ideal situation, but they don't have to. Any relationship a child can have with a caring adult, any relationship an adult can have with other caring adults who are trustworthy is terrific. It will help us with that. And as adults, we don't have to have just one relationship. We can have a number of them to suit different needs and different times in our week, in our life, and whatever. So creating those bonds and strengthening them, that is my thing I'm working on this year, is opening up to that. So maybe some of you would want to join me with that. Inclusion is really critical. If we don't feel like we belong to a group, if we feel like we're the odd man out and we just don't fit in anywhere, our self-confidence diminishes, our ability to reach out diminishes. It becomes really just paralyzing for us. And we saw this recently with a group of kids with a program we started called Bike to Leadership with Vancouver School District and Bike Clark County. And we developed a 10-week program initially. I think it's a little shorter now, but 10 weeks, twice a week. We picked about 15 kids at the high school who just didn't feel like they fit anywhere. They weren't excelling particularly academically. They didn't have a sport or a social group they connected with. And so we offered them this opportunity to come to Bike Clark County and learn how to repair bikes, go on bike rides, learn to ride a bike, and they ultimately got to take the bike home that they had repaired. So they earned a bike through the process of it. So those kids over 10 weeks, 2 meetings a week, went from being very individual and very much untrustworthy of one another to the end game, where at the graduation, they received a t-shirt for Bike to Leadership, and they all ran out and put their t-shirts on and came back and wanted their photos taken all in their matching t-shirts, because they were now a group. They were a team. We were a team. And I asked them about, at one point I was working with them on an advocacy project for the community. What can you do to give back to the community? What are you going to advocate for? I gave them the option. I said, do you want to work individually or together? And they said, we're working together because we are a team. And you could see this pride. They're all dressed differently and had their different ways of thinking and being. And yet, maybe for the first time, they were really feeling like they belonged somewhere. And that's what they commented on in a video that a group put together for us about this, is they said this was a revolutionary experience to them, to feel like they were part of something. So I think that inclusion can be felt through a faith community, through Family Promise, through giving back, through whatever opportunities you can offer youth and anybody. That's really important. And then our intrinsic and extrinsic value mean the value we feel that we have within ourselves to give to our community, and value to ourselves, as well as what we offer to everyone else. And I think one of the great ways of building that is by thinking about the difference between praise and feedback. So if you've got little children or adults or coworkers or your employees, instead of just always saying, hey, great job, or way to go, which is praise, instead think about letting them know that you see them, that you notice them, and give them some real feedback that says, hey, I noticed that you reached out and shared something with this, you shared your toys with this child that's also here at Family Promise. Or I saw that you took a risk and applied for this job today. And I want to tell you, that really showed me how much you're trying and making steps in your life. So giving that kind of feedback lets people know, wow, I do matter. Someone sees me for who I am, and that builds intrinsic value. Capability is the second key to resilience, and that's the skills we learn and the knowledge we have, sometimes through schooling, sometimes through education. But every experience we have in life can give us new skills and new knowledge that we can use in employment or use to help ourselves self-regulate. So anything that we offer to folks about that, maybe social skills, maybe self-regulation skills, can really help us. And those are things sometimes that people who've grown up in an unpredictable, volatile environment may not have even been around, as things like discipline or learning how to follow a schedule or how to keep calm. And we need to help those folks learn that, maybe for the first time. So anything that we're able to do to teach soft skills to people who have not received them before can be amazingly helpful. And finally, our community, culture, and faith. And I understand from talking with Dave that your guests are not required to participate in faith community events and traditions, but it's open to them. And I think that we have found with the Faith Fund, Family, Friends, and Food, that faith is one of the big key pillars to a successful and long life. So it doesn't have to be faith in a particular religious doctrine, but maybe some kind of faith beyond yourself, or communing with nature, or whatever it might be. But whatever that is, finding your hope for your future and your vision And I've had some people push back on that and say, well, if you have great expectations and hopes for the future, it can just be dashed and ruin your resilience altogether. But our studies that are being done at universities right now are really showing that without hope, without being able to imagine a better place for ourselves, we tend more to give up and live in a negative place. So whatever we can do to help people vision and take steps gives that hope. So traditions, if you do not have traditions as part of Family Promise, you might want to think about that. What are your welcoming traditions? What are your birthday traditions? What are your family traditions that you're helping people so that they can feel that they truly belong? And helping the families to make up their own family traditions so they know they belong there. And finally, I believe that you are surrounding folks with a network of services. And I believe that as a community, we're working on that and talking about that all the time too. So that's important. Relationships are number one. I have said that over and over again in today's training, and I want to be sure that's severely cemented into your brains that relationships, put that number one with folks. Reach out, talk. Doesn't mean that everybody has to be your best friend, but just let them know that you're there, that you care, that you respect and preserve dignity for them. We talked about the skills, and certainly self-regulation skills are a key and important part of that. And so having calming techniques that you can turn to when you're distressed and being able to share that with some of the families that you work with, or having that for your employees and volunteers, can be a great way to start your workday or your sessions or entry into your program. Like we've done today, we did breathing, we did stuff to ground ourselves, but this is a whole lot of things. And you might try to think about, can we incorporate any of those into our environments for our families, and then bring these to their attention so that they might be able to duplicate them again when they have their own home. Or their nice, pleasant smells. And of course, that's subjective, but are there transition breaks from one activity to the other? Do you incorporate pleasant music? And is it the type of music that person wants? Are we teaching self-care? Is there meditation being taught? So these are all things that can help us with calming ourselves. And that is very key and certainly a skill that we want to pursue. I don't know if everybody has their handout, but within the handout was this little piece about this gentleman. His name is Mike. And if you don't have it, I'm going to read it to us. We'll just do a quick little activity with this. But as I read this, I want you to just keep track of the life events and characteristics that really stick out for you about this gentleman, Mike, as we read through this, and then we'll share that at the end. Okay, so get your pencil and paper. Just note anything that pops out to you about what's a characteristic or life event about this person. So growing up, Mike loved his dad like no one else. My father took me everywhere. We went fishing. We were always together. I always looked forward to, even if I wasn't with him, when he would get home. Mike's beloved father died from a heart attack when Mike was 8 years old. That tore my heart apart, said Mike, because he was the love of my life. Mike ended up in foster care and institutions. I had babysitters for a while, and then my mom, and she couldn't control me, so she sent me off. After that, I had to deal with a different type of family life, and I just felt like I was never loved. Mike loves the mountains and the woods, but for more than 25 years, his work as a logger also kept him stuck in remote areas in a culture where heavy drinking and drugs were the norm. He didn't like it, but he wasn't immune to the influences around him. He got into trouble several times for drug use and drunk driving. Mike admits he had a violent streak when he'd been drinking. He picked up a felony assault conviction nearly 15 years ago and is registered as a violent offender in Montana. A felony record presents hurdles to both employment and housing. Mike's hard labor jobs took a toll on his body. He suffers from 2 fractured vertebrae, degenerative joint disease, scoliosis, stenosis, and nerve damage. He is no longer fit to work in the only kind of job he's ever done, and he couldn't afford more than an occasional visit to a clinic to address his health problems. Usually all they would offer was pain medication, which themselves brought a slew of other problems. Mike now receives more holistic, healing-focused care at a local free clinic. They're going to help me get into surgery so I can get my back fixed and have a better life, said Mike. The only places Michael could afford on disability income, he calls home in North Idaho, where he calls home, were low-income apartments and trailer parks with a lot of drug and alcohol use. His frustration that sparked his latest run-in with law was last January when he saw a neighbor using meth out in the open. Mike was infuriated, chased the neighbor down in the driveway, and ended up being arrested for assault. That stint landed him in jail, and he lost his home and his dog. He didn't want to go back anyway, but in North Idaho, he had no option for clean and sober shelter, let alone permanent affordable housing. His social worker suggested a shelter in Spokane, and the country boy had no choice but to come to the city. Now he's glad to be here. I went through a lot of turmoil and a lot of praying just to get out of that situation. I don't want to go back to it. I want to be in a Christian environment. Mike's tendency to isolate took a toll on his physical and mental health. He wasn't eating enough or connecting with people, so when he went to jail, he was physically, mentally, and spiritually broken down. He suffered anxiety attacks and was transferred from the jail to a mental hospital. The hospital helped him regain stability, but he hated the medication they gave him. I turned into a zombie, he said. The free clinic helped him to adjust his medication, so he's now stable without the zombie feeling. He knows he needs help from others to manage and structure his life, people who help him do what it takes to stay healthy spiritually, physically, and mentally. He's learning what it looks like at the shelter, and he's looking to recovery housing options where he can continue to have support and accountability. So he's now been free from drugs, he's clean and sober, he's working well, and he's had time to reflect on his past and read the Bible. It's brought him a new life, the lights turned on, and he's not living in darkness anymore. Okay, I'm going to open up the chance for you to all share for just a 3 minutes. We'll talk about what did you notice? What things did you write down that were characteristics or events that were important about Mike? Anybody want to share?
He was put in a situation a lot of times where he had no choice.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Thank you. Other thoughts?
So I guess the defining moments of his life sound like the abandonment accidentally by his father and, you know, semi-accidentally, I guess, by his mother. I'm sure that she didn't know what to do, so she didn't feel like she had a choice either. But, you know, that rejection early in life is, it probably made him feel really worthless right from the beginning and unwanted.
Good point. So we've got no choices, abandonment, rejection. Anything else that people noticed about Mike?
I think
Sorry, Lindsay. While you're figuring that out, would someone else like to share? Or Lindsay, are you back now?
Lindsay, it may be your speaker is in the wrong place. You may need to put it behind the computer.
No, it's because we have 3 computers and a speaker. So I've seen this a lot in my career, these compounding events that happen that contribute to a decline in health and then the inability to work. And then people either go on disability if they can get disability. A lot of people spend years trying to get on disability and then they can't afford housing. And it just keeps them in this cycle of homelessness. And it's something that I've seen over and over again, where life choices lead to significant decline in health, leads to inability to work, leads to inability to find housing. And then they just can't get themselves out of the cycle on their own.
Good. Thank you. And one last one. I saw Valerie raised her hand. Valerie, did you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that he had a stable environment that he remembered fondly at the beginning. And I feel like it allowed him eventually to still have the hope of connecting and having a stable life again.
Good. I love to hear that, Valerie. And that's exactly the thing I want to come to here. How many of you in your list of things had more negatives than positives in your list of events and characteristics? So that is one thing we want to change when we start thinking from a trauma-informed perspective. We do want to acknowledge that negative things happen to people and trauma happens, but when you're working with a client or someone, you want to come at the situation from a strengths-based perspective, because there were a lot of things there. Exactly what Valerie said. He had an early relationship that was loving and stable. He had a place for coping, his mountains. He loved his mountains and he found peace there. He had a moral compass that he was able to reflect back on and know right from wrong. He was very hardworking and he had skills for working. He was open enough to seek care and to open himself and be flexible enough to do that and to even move to Spokane. He followed up with the free clinic to get surgery and was now looking forward to finding that care and moving forward with that. He had strong boundaries that when he moved in and saw that someone was using meth, his right from wrong maybe wasn't manifest in just the right way because it ended up getting him in trouble, but it did show that he has strong boundaries and was willing to act on those. He has faith, he believes in God, and he's willing to put the work in by reading the Bible and studying and doing what he needs to do to improve. He is changed from being isolating to surrounding himself with people who support him. He's now got a safe living environment. He understands his own accountability. He's been sober for a long time. He has hope and he wants to get better. So I think what we tend to do, and I am right in there with y'all, when I would, until I was taught about trauma-informed care, the first way I would see a client or a patient when I worked in the hospital was all the negatives and deficits and all the things that were working against them. But we can get a lot farther when we think about the positives and the strengths and help them see those and build on those instead of focusing on the negatives. The negatives are just a challenge, a barrier that we need to get across using the strengths that we've got or they've got. So I want to thank you for going through that little, and there was no right or wrong there. I just wanted to try to make a little point. So I think everything that y'all pointed out about some of the challenges that he had, super big challenges, super big. But yet somehow with the supports around him and his own internal capability and intrinsic value, he found a way through that. So I hope that that was useful. So just to go on, a way that might be manifest in our thinking is to just think about how we respond versus react to situations. So a reaction is kind of your knee jerk. It comes out of maybe your own trauma or your own life experience. It takes a little more thought to think about, wait a minute, how would I respond in a more trauma-informed, compassionate, caring, relationship-forward way? So a traditional reaction might be someone makes a mistake. Oh no, look what you did. Why did you do that? Instead, you might say, oh, tell me what happened. I'm ready to listen, or I'm ready to help. Instead of saying, oh gosh, you can't do that right here, let me just do it for you because we need to get going. Instead, you say, you know what? I know you can do this. I have patience. I'll wait. How can I support you to do yourself? Do we need to review the instructions? Whatever that might be. Instead of saying, can't you do anything right? Instead, you can just acknowledge mistakes can be frustrating, but they are how we learn and they're okay because we all make them. So let's talk about the possible alternatives. Because remember there again, alternatives and breaking things down into steps. It's important for people who've had trauma to learn that skill. And then another one, calm down now or you're out of this program. Instead saying, I can see you're really extremely frustrated. Are you also hungry? Do you need a snack or a break? Or could we just breathe together for a minute? And then when we're more relaxed, I'm so ready to listen to you. So you can kind of see how our traditional responses can be a little bit different when we apply some of these trauma-informed principles. And I'm going to end up in my last little bit today talking about self-care because it's so important. None of us can give if none of us can pour from an empty cup. We can't give if we have not filled our own buckets up as well. And so for many of us who really put the emphasis on giving to others, we put ourselves last and we keep giving and giving until we're just a wrung out rag and we have nothing left. And especially if we're working a job, doing volunteer work, giving to our families, we can get really run down. And it can make us not only psychologically hurt, but also physically. We can get sick. We can end up missing work, end up not being able to show up to help people, and just not be there in a trauma-informed way to help each other. So in a lot of places that become trauma-informed, we start with self-care and the care for the people who are providing the care. So let's look at what that means. In your packet, I included something kind of a self-care wheel. And you can put whatever you want into those different windows around the wheel. But the idea in the middle is that you achieve overall balance and that you don't escape from or avoid any one particular part of your life. A lot of people, you'll say, oh, do you do self-care? Oh, yes, I run. Every day I run. Or I eat only vegetables, or whatever their answer might be. That's great. Maybe that's taking care of your physical aspect of self-care. But what about relationships? Are you giving that equal time and really thinking about how are you forming relationships and taking care of the relationships in your life? What are you doing for your professional development or your learning? Are you attuning to and attending to your spiritual development? Are you doing a reading every day? Do you have a group that you get together with? Do you have a faith community or whatever is good for you? And your psychological care. How are you taking care of things that are troubling you? What do you do for your anxieties? How are you learning more about taking care of yourself? Have you read anything about trauma lately and how to alleviate that? So, and the more specific ideas that I'd like to share with you is, first of all, make those connections. We know that's important. Practice some of the self-regulation techniques we talked about. Avoid seeing crisis as insurmountable problems. This is what we find with people who have trauma thinking. If they run up against a barrier, they think it's all off, that everything's off, nothing's going to work, and they want to just give up. But instead, just say, oh, this is a little barrier in my way. How can I get around it? What can I draw on in my personal value that I can use to help me get over this hurdle? Everything will pass in life. And then accept that change is part of living. I used to be so dead set on what my plan was for every day until I had kids. And then all of a sudden I started waking up in the morning and I realized every morning, the only thing I can count on today is that I can't count on anything, that whatever I had planned, it probably was not going to happen, because that's just part of raising kids. And I think that if we keep that mindset every day, that, okay, I can have a general outline here, but I'm ready to shift and move because I'm flexible and nimble and I can meet my day's needs. That's just a part of living. We're going to keep moving toward goals. Having goals set, small, medium, large goals, can really help us be successful and stay on track and give us that hope. And then take decisive action. Psychologists tell us that when we're anxious or depressed, it's the inaction that can keep us there. So even if it's not a huge action, and even if it's the wrong action, it may be better to take some action because you can start to feel that momentum of moving forward. So take an action, take a decisive one. Invest in your self-discovery, exploring new hobbies, new talents. Keep a positive view of yourself and reassure yourself. Remember, growth mindset. Mistakes are something everybody makes. It's how we learn. I'm not going to hold back because I'm afraid. I'm a strong, brave person and I have value in this world. Keep those priorities of yours in perspective. Keep hope and take care of your health. And speaking of health, I just want to say, if you have an EAP program that you can turn to for mental health counseling when you need it, or if your benefits plan offers you regular checkups, doctor visits, and time with your mental health practitioners, that is so valuable. Please take action for that. If you don't have that, you might reach out if you're employed and advocate for that, because that is one of the big stressors people have in life, is not knowing where they're going to turn if they have a health or a mental health crisis. So I strongly advocate for that. So I'm going to end you with this thought that the solution to all of adult problems today depends in large measure on the way our children grow up. Adult problems tomorrow depend in large measure on the way our children grow up today. And we can do so much not only for the children who are truly children today, but the children we carry inside ourselves and everyone carries with around us. So I want to thank you so much, and I'm going to open this for questions and answers.